Yo, what's up everyone, it's Wizardium and today we're checking out what if ancient magic chose Harry and Hermione as the new founders of Hogwarts. Drop a like if you're hyped, subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The Claiming the Castle Smelled Like Ash and Old Rain. Hermione had been warned about it, Professor McGonagall had mentioned it in the letter, somewhere between the request for volunteer rebuilders and the apology for the state of the grounds, but warnings about smells never quite prepared you for the actual experience of walking through a doorway and having grief enter your lungs like smoke. She stopped just inside the Great Hall's entrance and breathed through it, the way she'd learned to breathe through things, counted her own heartbeat, moved on. The ceiling was open to the sky, not in the enchanted way she'd loved for 7 years, stars shifting overhead while she pretended to eat breakfast and actually read, just genuinely open, a ragged wound of stone and timber where the roof had partially collapsed during the final hours of the battle. Morning light fell in at a wrong angle through it, illuminating dust motes and the ghosts of where 4 long tables had stood. 3 of them were still there, actually. Pushed to one side by whoever had started the preliminary clearing, the Slytherin table was missing, which Hermione found she didn't have strong feelings about either way. "You're doing the face," said a voice behind her. She turned. Harry was standing 2 feet back, hands in the pockets of the muggle jacket he'd started wearing constantly since May, dark grey, slightly too large, bought from a charity shop in Grimmauld Place's neighbourhood because he'd said quietly that he didn't want to wear robes for a while. He was watching her with the particular expression he'd had since the battle, the one that was trying very hard to look like his normal face but had a quality underneath it like still water over something deep. "What face?" she said, "The one where you're making a list of everything wrong and calculating how long it'll take to fix it." "That's just my face. Hermione, I've known your face for 7 years. That one specifically means the list is very long." She looked back at the hall, at the collapsed ceiling and the pushed-aside furniture and the scorch marks on the stone walls that no amount of Scourgify was going to fully erase. "The list," she said, "is extremely long." Harry came to stand beside her. They looked at it together for a moment, which was something they'd become very good at since the war, standing in ruined places together without needing to fill the silence with something useful. Ron had come with them for the first 2 weeks of that, the immediate aftermath, the funerals and the ministry visits and the borough dinners where nobody ate much. Then George had needed him more, and Harry and Hermione had continued the touring of ruins more or less on their own. "McGonagall said the East Wing is stable," Harry said. "The astronomy tower held. Most of the dungeons are fine, obviously because they're dungeons, they're built to survive things." "The library?" Hermione asked, and she was proud of how even her voice came out. "Mostly intact, some water damage from the broken windows." She said Madame Pince has been sleeping there every night with a drying charm running continuously. That was so exactly right that Hermione almost smiled. "Where do we start?" "She's got teams organized." Harry pulled a folded parchment from his pocket, McGonagall's precision in list form, names and assignments, and a diagram of the castle marked in red and green and yellow depending on structural integrity. Hermione had been given a copy too, but Harry had been carrying his everywhere, which she thought said something about him she wasn't sure he'd identified yet. He needed something to hold. "We're on the 7th floor, the corridor outside the room of requirement." Which was, Hermione did not say aloud, where Fred had been standing when he died. Harry knew she didn't say it. He folded the parchment back up. "Come on then." The 7th floor corridor was worse than the Great Hall because it had no open sky, just devastation contained inside intact walls, which gave it a claustrophobic quality the hall lacked. Sections of the ceiling had come down, 2 suits of armor lay dismantled across the floor, pieces scattered like a child's abandoned game. The tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy was burned along one side, the troll's tutu still visible but the instructor troll now missing from the scene entirely, as though he'd finally had enough. There were already 6 people working when Harry and Hermione arrived. Neville Longbottom, forearms already grey with stone dust, directed a careful mobilicorpus variation at a chunk of masonry roughly the size of a small car. Ginny Weasley was beside him, her wand tracing stabilization patterns along a section of wall that had cracked vertically from floor to ceiling. 2 of the Patel twins, Harry could never reliably tell from the back, were working in tandem on the armor pieces, and 2 older wizards from the rebuilding committee that McGonagall had organized were consulting over a set of architectural diagrams at the far end of the corridor. "Harry." Neville grinned, sweat visible at his temples despite the early hour and the September chill. "Hermione, good, I need someone to anchor this while I move it. It's heavier than it looks and every time I try to float it higher it shifts." Harry had his wand out before the sentence finished. "Tell me when." What followed was 2 hours of the kind of work that magic made faster but not easy, the kind where you still got tired, still got dusty, still occasionally said something under your breath that would have earned points docked if there'd been a teacher nearby. Hermione worked with Ginny on the structural diagnostics, running a continuous assessment charm along the walls, while Ginny marked the results with color-coded permanent ink that McGonagall's committee could read later. They didn't talk much but worked with the easy efficiency of 2 people who'd learned to coordinate without requiring constant verbal check-ins, and when Ginny made a dry comment about the trolls in the tapestry, Hermione laughed properly for the first time in what felt like weeks. Harry was everywhere. That was the only way to describe it. He moved between tasks with a restless energy that Hermione recognized as his version of the same thing she was doing, using the work to hold himself in place, to give the grief somewhere to go. He was also genuinely good at the reconstruction magic, which shouldn't have surprised her but somehow did, because Harry had always been brilliant at the aggressive, responsive magic of combat and less interested in the deliberate, patient magic of building. But he was learning the patience. She watched him spend 20 minutes coaxing a cracked stone block back into its original position with millimeter precision, when she knew perfectly well he could have forced it with brute power in 30 seconds, and she thought, not for the first time, that whatever was happening to Harry Potter post-Voldemort was not the diminishment that people who only saw his exhaustion might assume. He was becoming something. She just didn't have a word for it yet. Around mid-morning, they stopped for water and food that the Hogwarts elves, deeply distressed by the castle's state, and channeling that distress into cooking with extraordinary urgency, had sent up in a basket that appeared very slightly to refill itself when no one was looking. Hermione sat on a cleared section of floor, ate half a sandwich, and pulled out a notebook. Harry sat beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched and ate steadily while looking at the opposite wall where Ginny was still working. "How many more days do you think?" he asked. "For this corridor, 3, maybe 4. She was doing calculations in the margin of her notebook. "For the whole castle, McGonagall said the committee estimates 4 months minimum, but that's with standard reconstruction magic." She paused, her quill going still. "There are some texts about the original construction, how the founders built this place. The magic they used it wasn't just architecture, it was intention, layered into the stone. That's why the wards are what they are, why the castle responds the way it does." She hesitated. "I keep thinking about whether that matters for the rebuild, whether we need to think about the how, not just the what." Harry looked at her sideways. "You think rebuilding it with committee magic loses something?" "Think it's possible?" She clicked the end of her quill against the notebook. "I don't have evidence yet. When has that ever stopped you from being right? Always have evidence, Harry." "Sure," he said in the tone that meant you don't actually need it and we both know it. He took another bite of his sandwich. "What would the original magic even feel like? How would we know?" She opened her mouth to answer and the castle answered first. "It started in the floor, not an earthquake, nothing so crude." More like the castle took a breath, a deep subterranean expansion and contraction that Hermione felt through her palms where they rested on the stone and through her feet, and then it moved upward through her spine with a sensation she could only describe later as recognition. The way your own name sounds when someone says it unexpectedly in a crowded room, the way it lands before you've processed it. Harry went completely still beside her. Neville looked up from across the corridor. "Did you feel that?" Ginny finished. "Yes. But the feeling was different for them." Hermione could see it in their faces, the slight confusion of having perceived something and not being certain what. For Hermione the sensation was huge, that was the word. It was huge in a way that physical size couldn't capture, the way the ocean is huge not because of its width but because of its depth. Like something ancient becoming briefly aware of her, and then not merely aware but interested, and then not merely interested but she was on her feet without choosing to stand. Harry was beside her also standing and his eyes had a quality she'd only seen twice before. Once at Dumbledore's grave when he'd told Voldemort directly that he had something worth living for, and once in the Forbidden Forest when he'd walked to his death and kept walking. Total, unclouded clarity. The floor pulsed again. "Harry," she said, and her voice came out calm, which surprised her. "Something is, I know." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the stretch of blank wall between 2 torches, the wall you would walk past 3 times while thinking very hard about what you needed, and his hand had found her wrist without apparent conscious decision. His grip was light but very certain. "Do you feel it from that direction?" She did. She turned. The blank wall looked exactly as it always had, and it was also, simultaneously, a door. The 2 committee wizards had stopped working entirely. Neville had taken several steps back, his expression shifting from confusion to something more alert. Ginny was watching Harry and Hermione with an expression that Hermione, in some peripheral part of her awareness, filed away to think about later, because it looked less like shock and more like someone watching a thing they'd half expected come true. Harry walked toward the wall. Hermione walked beside him, which was simply what she did. She was aware of the choice happening, but it wasn't really a choice in any meaningful sense. You don't choose to breathe. The wall opened, not with a grinding of stone or a dramatic flash of light, nothing performed. One moment it was wall and the next moment it was a doorway, and beyond the doorway was a room that had not been there 5 minutes ago and had been there for 1,000 years. It was not large. That was the first thing that registered. For something this significant, Hermione had half expected a grand hall or a cavernous chamber, but it was roughly the size of a comfortable sitting room, perfectly circular, with walls of bare stone that caught the light from 4 sconces positioned at the cardinal points. The floor was smooth and very old and faintly warm underfoot through her boots, which she only registered because she and Harry had both stepped through the doorway without discussion. In the center of the room, arranged around a circular inlay of dark stone, were 4 chairs. Not thrones, they were too austere and too serious for that word. Solid wood, very old, carved with symbols along the arms and backs that Hermione recognized immediately as early-period runic script of the type that predated standardization, the kind you had to know the context of to read properly. Each chair was different. One had been made from wood that still looked alive, pale and supple. One was black walnut, heavy and deeply carved. One was oak, severe and unadorned. And one was Harry stopped walking. The fourth chair was ash wood, and it had turned to face them, not moving. It wasn't moving when she looked directly at it, but it had been a moment ago, in the peripheral instant before her attention landed on it. She was certain of it. The ash chair and the black walnut chair had turned, had oriented in the half-second before they looked. "Those are," Hermione started. "Don't explain it," Harry said, not unkindly. "Not yet." She closed her mouth. Fair, they stood at the edge of the circular inlay, and the room was very quiet, and the warmth from the floor was moving upward through both of them, and the runic carvings on the walls had begun very softly to glow. "They feel like us," Harry said after a long moment, still looking at the ash chair. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way he got when he was setting something aside to feel later because feeling it now would be inconvenient. "Don't they?" "Yes," Hermione said, because this was precisely not the moment to hedge. "The ash and the walnut, they feel like us." "Right," he exhaled slowly. "All right." He walked to the ash chair and sat down. The room sang. That was the only possible word, a sound below hearing that Hermione felt in her teeth and her chest and behind her eyes, the sound of something very old engaging with something it had been waiting for, and the runic glyphs on the walls flared gold and then settled into a steady, warm luminescence, and the carved symbols along the arms of the ash chair lit beneath Harry's hands where they rested on the wood, and his head went back slightly. Not in pain, but in the way someone tilts their head back when something unexpected and enormous is falling into place. Hermione sat in the black walnut chair, and the room sang a second time, a different note that braided with the first into something so harmonically perfect it made her eyes water with the sheer rightness of it, and the feeling that moved through her was, she had read about Founder's magic. Of course she had. The theory of it, the history, Bathilda Bagshot's careful and somewhat dry analysis in A History of Magic, the more speculative work in Adalric Frost's The Living Castle, the runic foundations described in Penelope Clearwater's thesis on Hogwarts wards that Hermione had tracked down in the Hogwarts library in third year and read twice. She had read all of it, and none of it had come close to this. This was the castle knowing her. Not the soft familiarity of 7 years of walking its corridors, something vaster, something geological. The castle was old, and it had been waiting, and it was recognizing her in the way that something very ancient recognizes something it helped to shape. As though the education, the curiosity, the relentless hunger for understanding that Hogwarts had fed and sharpened for 7 years had been, in some deep and backward way, the castle investing in its own future. The glyphs on her chair spelled out in early runic script a single word she did not immediately know. She filed that away too. The light held for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it eased, not extinguished but settled, and Hermione became aware that her heart was beating very fast, and she was gripping the arms of the chair as though they might otherwise escape, and Harry was looking at her from across the circle with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not surprise. That was the first thing she registered. The surprise was absent, which was strange because Harry was surprised by most things that happened to him on this scale. What was there instead was something more complicated. Wonder, yes, and a thread of something fierce, and underneath both of those, reaching up from whatever deep place in him it lived, an enormous and very quiet relief. "Well," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That was, yes. Are you all right?" She did an internal inventory. Her magic felt different, not depleted or altered in any concerning way, but expanded, like a room she'd been navigating in the dark that someone had just turned on every light in. She could feel the castle, not metaphorically. She could feel the structural load on the 7th floor corridor, the water still pooled in 3 classrooms on the 4th floor from broken windows, the particular anxiety emanating from the library where Madame Pince was, at this moment, carefully charming a water-damaged copy of Encyclopedia of Toadstools back to health. She could feel all of it, and it was vast, and it was intricate, and it was also, because the alternative, she decided immediately, was madness, manageable. "Remarkably, yes," she said. I can feel there are places where the wards are broken. I can feel the gaps. It's like standing in a room with holes in the walls. I can feel where the wind is getting in." He was looking at his hands, which had a faint gold luminescence in the skin that was fading as she watched. "That's a ward thing, isn't it? That's what that is." "Yes," she said. "I think you're feeling the outer perimeter wards. I think I'm feeling the internal structure." She stood up carefully because her legs were less steady than she'd have liked, and looked at the runic inscription on her chair. She committed it to memory in the way she'd always committed things to memory, not just as image but as meaning, beginning the translation in the back of her mind while the front attended to more immediate concerns. "Harry, we were just very publicly in a corridor with 5 other people when that happened." Harry looked at the doorway where 3 silhouettes were visible in the frame: Neville, Ginny, and one of the committee wizards, a grey-haired man named Aldous Pemberton, who Hermione knew had been with the Ministry's Department of Magical Buildings for 30 years and who was, she suspected from his expression, already composing a report in his head. "Should we have a plan?" Harry asked, in the calm way he asked things when the answer was obviously yes, but he was checking whether she'd already made one. "We have about 8 seconds before someone comes through that door and starts asking questions," she said. "I suggest we don't have a plan. I suggest we just tell the truth and see what it does." Harry stood up from the ash chair, brushed stone dust from his jacket, and turned to face the doorway. "Right," he said. "Come in, then." What followed was messy and immediate in the way that reality was generally messier and more immediate than plans accounted for. Neville came through the door first and stopped dead at the sight of the glowing glyphs on the walls, still softly lit, and said bloody hell with the same tone he'd used when he'd decapitated Nagini, which was to say the tone of someone who had decided to simply deal with things as they arrived. Ginny came in beside him and looked at Harry and Hermione and the two particular chairs and said absolutely nothing, which was more eloquent than most speeches. Pemberton came in with his architectural diagrams still in his hands and his mouth open. "You felt it," Harry said, not a question. He was looking at Pemberton specifically. "The whole castle felt it," Pemberton said, and his voice had the quality of a man holding something very fragile. "Whatever you did, Mr. Potter, Miss Granger, it sent a pulse through every ward, every structure from the dungeons to the astronomy tower. I've been doing this for 30 years and I have never—" He stopped. "Started again. Those are the Founders' chairs. We noticed," Harry said. "The magic that came off them." Pemberton paused again, looking at the glyphs. "I need to report this." "I know," Harry said, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested this was a problem. No anxiety, no hedging, no preemptive apology. Hermione felt something in her chest respond to it. She'd always known Harry was capable of this particular kind of directness. She'd watched it operate under fire many times, but it was different somehow, seeing it here in a context that wasn't a life-or-death emergency. He was simply certain. "Tell McGonagall first. The minister will need to—" "McGonagall first," Harry said in a tone that ended the sentence. Pemberton looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental in his worldview, and then he nodded and left. Ginny waited until his footsteps had receded down the corridor before she said, "Both of you." She was looking back and forth between them with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been something more complicated. "The castle chose both of you together." "Apparently," Hermione said. Ginny nodded slowly. Her eyes went to Harry and something passed between them, not painful exactly, but acknowledgement. The kind of look that meant a conversation had already happened internally that the speakers would get to eventually. "Right," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "Good, you two can actually fix this place." "There's no guarantee we know how," Hermione said. "You'll figure it out." Ginny said it with the easy certainty of someone who had watched them for years. "You always do." Neville, who had been moving around the perimeter of the room examining the glyphs with his wand held up in a scanning position, stopped at the east wall and said without turning around, "These two chairs are lit and these two are dark. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw." "That's my read, yes," Hermione said. "So Hufflepuff and Slytherin are still waiting." For now, she wasn't sure what else to say about that yet. The implications were substantial and she was still running calculations on them. "Slytherin's going to be fun," Neville said dryly and turned around with a grin that was so purely Neville, pragmatic, dry, fundamentally unfrightened, that Hermione found herself returning it. "We'll see," Harry said. His attention had gone to the doorway again, the corridor beyond it, and Hermione followed his gaze and saw what he was seeing. The light from the room was falling into the corridor, warm and golden, illuminating the stone dust and rubble and the burned edges of the tapestry. That light, the damage, looked different. Not less. She was not interested in magical thinking that softened what needed to be faced directly but set against something, contextualized. The rubble was in the foreground and the warm gold was behind it, and the corridor looked less like a ruin and more like a place in the middle of becoming. "We should get back to work," Harry said. "We're not done with this section." Hermione picked up her notebook from where she'd left it on the floor outside the room. She uncapped her quill, thought for a moment, and wrote the runic word from the chair's inscription in the margin. She would look up its full meaning later. She already knew the root. The root meant foundation. By the time news reached McGonagall, news had also reached everyone else. Wizarding communication being what it was, and Hogwarts volunteer rebuilding staff being predominantly people who knew people who knew people. By early afternoon, what had happened in the 7th floor corridor had been described, embellished, analysed and debated all the way to Hogsmeade, and then via owl post considerably farther. McGonagall arrived at the circular room at 2 in the afternoon with Professor Flitwick at her side, and a controlled expression on her face that told Hermione she was feeling something significant and had decided that this was not the moment for it. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She looked at the two lit chairs. She looked at Harry and Hermione, who had continued working in the corridor and come back to the room twice since the morning to check on the state of the glyphs, which had not dimmed. "Sit down, please," she said, and her voice was very quiet. They sat, and the chairs recognized them again without ceremony, a settling, a warmth, a sense of the room orienting. McGonagall watched this with the expression she'd worn at the Battle of Hogwarts when she'd watched her animated desks march against Death Eaters, the expression of someone who had already made peace with everything being extraordinary from here on out and was proceeding accordingly. The ministry has already been in contact, she said. Kingsley knows. He is considerably more reasonable about this than the official response is going to be, I suspect. There will be a formal inquiry. There will be people who want oversight of whatever this means. There will be people who want to control what Hogwarts becomes. There will be, Harry agreed pleasantly. You don't seem alarmed by that. I'm not. McGonagall studied him. You have changed, Harry. Things happened to me, he said with the slight dry undertone that passed in Harry for dark humor. It had an effect. Something moved briefly through McGonagall's face, grief, Hermione thought, and pride, and the specific ache of watching someone you've known since childhood be irrevocably adult. The magic that came through the castle this morning, she said, looking now at both of them. Flitwick and I have been going over the historical records. What occurred, the activation of a founder's seat, has not happened since the castle was originally built. The theory has always been that the magic is tied to exceptional, she paused, choosing her word, compatibility, not just power, compatibility with what Hogwarts is meant to be. A place of learning, Hermione said, protection, belonging. Yes, McGonagall looked at her for a moment and the controlled expression cracked just slightly at the edges. Yes, those things precisely. Flitwick, who had been examining the glyphs on the walls with the focused attention of a man who had spent his whole life loving magic for exactly this kind of astonishing elaborateness, turned around and said, the runes are activated beyond what theory suggested was possible for 2 chairs alone. Whatever these 2 have done, Minerva, it isn't merely succession, it's a renewal. The deep magic, the living magic, it's responding to them. He beamed, which was so classically Flitwick that Hermione felt a wave of pure, uncomplicated affection for him. It's extraordinary, I have so many questions. I'll answer all of them, Hermione said immediately, as soon as I've found a working theory for what just happened to us. That might take some time, Flitwick said, still beaming. Give me a week. Harry made a sound that was almost a laugh, almost. McGonagall looked between them one more time, and then she straightened, the physical manifestation of a decision being made, and said, then I suggest you both plan to be here when the ministry delegation arrives tomorrow morning, because whatever this is and whatever it means, Hogwarts is going to need its new founders present. It was the first time anyone had used that word aloud, founders. It fell into the warm-lit room and the lit chairs and the ancient runic glyphs, and it sounded, Hermione thought, exactly right and completely terrifying and entirely inevitable all at once. Harry looked at her, she looked at him. Tomorrow morning then, he said to McGonagall, but his eyes were still on Hermione, and they were asking something she didn't quite have language for yet but was already, in the part of herself that worked beneath words, beginning to answer. I'll need that week on the theory, she said. Start tonight, he agreed. Outside, through the corridor and the broken castle and the open wound of the great hall's ceiling, the sun was beginning to go down. In the circular room the glyphs held their steady gold, and the 2 lit chairs were side by side in the warm light, and the castle, for the first time since May, was quiet in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like waiting. Something was beginning, the stones knew it. So did they? Chapter 2. The weight of old magic. The theory took 4 days, not 1 week. Hermione considered this a personal failure until Harry pointed out that she had essentially reverse-engineered a 1,000-year-old magical framework from first principles, while simultaneously helping rebuild a structurally compromised castle and fielding questions from a ministry delegation, and that perhaps she could allow herself the extra 3 days without self-flagellation. She told him that was a very reasonable perspective, and then continued to be privately irritated about the timeline. The theory, when it came at 2 in the morning on the 4th night, in the small study room off the library that Madame Pince had quietly designated as Hermione's workspace by placing a fresh supply of quills on the desk and never mentioning it. The room had a window that overlooked the grounds, and Hermione had been staring out of it for the better part of an hour while her notes lay open and increasingly annotated around her when the shape of it finally arrived whole. She wrote for 3 uninterrupted hours. By the time she was done her hand ached and she'd filled 11 pages and the window showed the first grey suggestion of dawn, and she sat back in her chair and read through it twice and was satisfied. Not complete, not finished. But the foundation was right and she knew the difference. She went to find Harry. He was in the room of requirement, or what had been the room of requirement, which no longer manifested in the traditional sense. The door still opened, the space still existed, but the Fiendfare had burned something essential out of its capacity for transformation. What remained was a large, bare room with excellent acoustics and a floor that was somehow always slightly warm, and Harry had taken to coming here at night when the particular quality of post-war sleeplessness that afflicted him became inconvenient in the dormitory. He was sitting against the far wall with his legs stretched out and his jacket on over a grey t-shirt, and he had a cup of tea that was almost certainly cold and a book open in his lap that he was almost certainly not reading, because his eyes were fixed on the middle distance with the expression of someone conducting an argument with themselves. He looked up when she came in, and the expression shifted immediately into something more present. That was one of the things she'd noticed about Harry in the months since May. He was very far away sometimes, in a private geography she didn't try to map, but he came back fast when she arrived. Faster than he came back for most things. Theory, he said. Theory, she confirmed and sat cross-legged on the floor beside him and spread her notes between them. She explained it properly, the way she explained things when she wasn't performing for an audience but actually thinking alongside someone, not linearized, not simplified, but the real architecture of it, following her own logical chain with the occasional tangent where two ideas branched unexpectedly. Harry listened the way he always listened to her when she did this, which was with full attention and minimal interruption, and she had learned years ago that this was not passivity on his part but a very active kind of engagement. He was tracking it, finding the points where it connected to things he understood instinctively, letting the two versions of understanding overlap and reinforce. The core of it was this: Hogwarts had not merely been built by the founders, it had been made from them. Their intent, their belief, their essential magical nature had been literally woven into the stone and the wards and the deep enchantments, the same way Ollivander's wand cores were bonded to their wood, not mechanically assembled but fundamentally integrated. The castle was, in a sense, a living extension of four people. And when those people died, the castle had not simply stopped, it had continued on residual magic and institutional memory, the way an ecosystem continues after the original architects of its ecology are gone, maintaining, sustaining but no longer growing. What had happened in the circular room was the castle finding, for the first time in 1,000 years, something it recognized as compatible enough to accept. Not replacements for the original founders, it wasn't reincarnation or succession in a simple hereditary sense, more like resonance. The castle had been vibrating at a particular frequency for 1,000 years, and Harry and Hermione happened, by some combination of who they were and what they'd survived and what they believed, to vibrate at something close enough that the deep magic had simply said, yes, it's why we can feel different things, she said, tapping two separate pages of her notes. You feel the perimeter, the protections, the wards that keep things out. I feel the internal structure, the learning systems, the living enchantments inside the walls. Gryffindor was the fortress builder. Ravenclaw was the architect of knowledge. The castle divided its recognition of us along those lines. Harry was quiet for a moment. What about Hufflepuff and Slytherin? The seats are still dark, but they're not inactive. She paused. I think the castle is waiting to see what we do. Harry considered this, before it decides if we're enough or if it needs more. That's my read, yes. He was quiet again, looking at her notes. Then the ministry delegation arrives in. He glanced at the grey light in the high windows. About 4 hours. I know, you haven't slept. I'll sleep after. He didn't push it. He picked up her third page of notes, the one with the runic translation she'd worked out for the inscription on her chair, and read it with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered. Foundation, he said. Yours says foundation. Yes. Mine says. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper which he handed to her, and which turned out to be his own very different kind of notes, not words but sketches, geometric and runic, the way he processed things spatially rather than textually. In the center of the sketch, inside the outline of a chair that was unmistakably the ash wood one, he'd written a single runic word and its translation below it. Shield. Hermione looked at it for a moment. Foundation and shield. She thought about what those two things were to each other structurally, how neither one was sufficient alone, how the combination of them was the basis of every protective architecture that had ever existed. She thought about the chairs side by side in the warm-lit room. She did not say any of the things she was thinking about that. Good, she said instead, refolding the sketch and handing it back to him. That fits the theory perfectly. Harry tucked it back in his pocket. Right, he said, I suppose we should both be awake and presentable in 4 hours. Presentable being relative, very relative. He reached over without looking and turned another page of her notes, idly reading. Hermione. Yes, you said the castle recognized us because of what we believe, not just power or ability, what we believe. Yes, what does it think we believe? It was a good question. A harder question than it sounded, because it was really asking her to articulate something she'd always acted on without fully examining. She looked at the dawn light in the window and thought about it honestly. That everyone belongs here, she said finally. That magic is for understanding, not just for winning. That the people you protect are more important than the power you accumulate. She paused. That you don't get to decide who matters based on where they came from. Harry was quiet for a beat and then said, yeah, that sounds right. He reached down and nudged the cold teacup away from her notes before she could knock it over without looking, the way you move things out of the way of someone you've known long enough to predict their disasters. Hermione didn't acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have made it a thing, and it was just the way they worked. But she noticed. She always noticed. The ministry delegation arrived at 9 in the morning, and they were 16 people, which was 14 more than Hermione had expected and suggested someone was very nervous about this. Harry and Hermione met them at the main gates with McGonagall, which was technically Harry's idea but also technically the only sensible choice. Meeting the ministry inside Hogwarts would have been conceding something neither of them was prepared to concede yet, and meeting them outside the gates was a statement that Hermione appreciated for its precision. This is the castle's threshold. You have not crossed it by invitation. Kingsley Shacklebolt was there, which was good. He was in his minister's robes, but wearing them the way he wore everything, like a man who could take them off if they became inconvenient. He met Harry's eyes with a warmth and a wariness in equal measure, and said, "Harry," and Harry said, "Minister," with a slight emphasis on the title that acknowledged both the formality and the friendship, and navigated the gap between them in 2 syllables, which was characteristically efficient. The problem was the man beside Kingsley. Hermione had done her research on Aldrich Thorne the moment his name had appeared on the delegation list. 53, former deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, currently serving as special advisor to the Minister for Reconstruction. Pureblood, old family, Slytherin graduate 2 decades before she was born, author of 3 published treatises on what he called the foundational balance of wizarding society, a term he used to mean in practice the idea that wizarding Britain's stability depended on maintaining certain traditional structures of magical governance that had existed since the founders' time and ought not to be disrupted by the enthusiasms of any particular generation. In person he was tall and spare, with silver hair kept short and very neat, and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades knowing that rooms fell quiet when he entered them. Not physically imposing, something more specific than that, the stillness of a man who had decided long ago that he had the right kind of mind for important decisions, and who had been surrounded by enough agreement to have the decision confirmed regularly. He looked at Harry and Hermione the way a very careful craftsman looks at a piece of work that has been made without his consultation. "Miss Granger," he said, "Mr. Potter, I understand something remarkable occurred here yesterday." 4 days ago, Hermione said, "And yes, the Ministry has a considerable interest in the reconstruction of Hogwarts," Thorne said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question, and was definitely an opening move. "Particularly as it concerns the school's governance going forward. Hogwarts has a headmistress," Harry said. "She's standing next to me." "Of course," Thorne smiled, which did not involve his eyes at any point. "But the question of the school's magical infrastructure, the nature of the changes that appear to have occurred in the wards, the foundational enchantments, these are matters that extend beyond the school's internal governance. They are matters of national magical security." "They are matters of Hogwarts," Harry said, in a tone that was very pleasant and entirely final. A slight pause moved through the delegation like weather. Several people exchanged glances. Kingsley's expression had gone very careful and very still, the way it went when he was watching something he didn't want to interrupt. "Mr. Potter," Thorne said, and his voice had acquired a quality of patient reasonableness that Hermione recognized immediately as the voice of a man who was accustomed to having patience be a winning tactic. "I want to be very clear that no one here is questioning your role, or Miss Granger's, in what has apparently occurred. What we are asking for is oversight. The ability to understand, to document, and to ensure that whatever changes are being made to the most significant magical institution in Britain are made with appropriate oversight." "From whom?" Hermione said. Thorne turned to her. "From representatives of the Ministry, the Wizengamot, and the appropriate stakeholder." "The Wizengamot," Hermione said, "currently has 3 seats held by people who were under Voldemort's administration 18 months ago and have not yet been formally reviewed. The stakeholder council you're proposing was recommended in a white paper authored by yourself 2 months ago. The Ministry's Department of Magical Buildings, whose representative was present when the activation occurred and filed a report within 40 minutes, does not have the expertise to assess Founders-level magic. So I'll ask again, oversight from whom specifically and with what qualifications?" The silence was different now, more textured. Thorne looked at her and she watched the recalibration happen behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of a man who had received less resistance than this from most people and was now identifying the level of the challenge. He was not, she noted with grudging precision, rattled. He simply upgraded his model of what he was dealing with. "Those are fair questions," he said. "Which is precisely why we would want to work with you, Miss Granger, in establishing appropriate." "We'll work with the Ministry," Harry said. "With Kingsley specifically. We'll provide regular documentation of what we're doing to the castle's magic, what changes are occurring, what we're rebuilding, and how. McGonagall will oversee the school's governance questions as she already does." He paused. "What we won't have is a committee with veto authority over Hogwarts' foundational magic. That's not a negotiation, and it's not something I'm interested in discussing further today." He said it the way he said most difficult things, not belligerently, not with heat, just with the quality of someone who has located exactly where they stand and found the ground solid. Hermione had stood beside him for 7 years watching him find that quality in crisis, under fire, in the worst possible circumstances. It was still something to see it operational on a Tuesday morning in front of a Ministry delegation. Thorne was quiet for 3 seconds. "I see," he said, and the 2 words contained a whole taxonomy of response that he was choosing not to deploy yet. He was a patient man, and he was, Hermione thought, going to be a patient adversary. "Then perhaps we might tour the school." "Certainly," McGonagall said, and that was that. Kingsley found Harry and Hermione at the far end of the entrance hall tour, where they drifted deliberately to the back while McGonagall occupied Thorne with the architectural assessments at the front. He appeared beside them with the practiced unobtrusiveness of a man who had spent years in intelligence work. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "He's going to be a problem," Hermione said, equally quiet. "Yes." Kingsley looked at Thorn's distant silver head, currently being subjected to a detailed explanation of load-bearing enchantments from Flitwick. "He's not wrong about everything. The public uncertainty about what's happening here, about what you two are, what Founders magic means practically, it's going to create pressure that's hard to manage. People are frightened of big changes right now for obvious reasons." "We know," Harry said. "We're not trying to make it harder for you." "I know that." Kingsley glanced at him. "I also know that if I try to put a governance committee over the two of you, I'll have wasted everyone's time. What I'd like is the documentation Hermione mentioned, formal, shareable, something that lets me manage the narrative before Thorn gets to write it himself." "How long do we have?" Hermione asked. "He's filing a formal proposal with the Wisengamot by end of the month. He's been building toward it since the battle. This isn't just a response to what happened." The activation gave him the urgency his argument needed. He was planning something like this regardless. That was worth knowing. Hermione filed it. "We'll have documentation to you within 2 weeks. Kingsley nodded. He started to turn away and then paused. "One more thing, there are families, I won't name them today, but you'll know which ones when they arrive, who are going to try to stake a claim to the castle's governance through hereditary lines. Pure-blood families who trace themselves back to the Founders' original student body. There's a legal argument being built around inherited magical entitlement." "That's not how Founders' magic works," Hermione said immediately. "No, but it's how their lawyers say it works." Kingsley's expression was dry. "Be ready." He drifted back toward the front of the tour group, pausing to ask Flitwick a question that redirected Thorn's attention neatly. Hermione watched this and thought that Kingsley Shacklebolt was very good at his job, and it was fortunate that he was the minister. "Hereditary entitlement," Harry said at her shoulder. "I know. How long do you think we have before that shows up, based on the pace of wizarding bureaucracy?" She glanced at her watch. 48 hours, optimistic, fine, 24, it was 18. The Selwyn family arrived the following afternoon. There were 5 of them, which felt theatrical. The patriarch, Cassian Selwyn, flanked by his 2 adult sons and accompanied by a family solicitor who clutched a leather document case with the urgency of a man who believed legal documents could stop magic if presented with sufficient conviction. They came to the gates and rang the bell that Hagrid had installed, which was a large bronze affair that sounded like a minor disaster every time it was used, and announced themselves to the portrait of a former Hogwarts groundskeeper that McGonagall had stationed there as a doorbell. Harry and Hermione came down together. This was not discussed or arranged. They were both in the grounds doing reconstruction work when the bell rang, and they simply both went, in the way that North and South Poles both go when a compass needle does. Cassian Selwyn was 60-something and very large, carrying the physical weight of a man who had once been athletic and had not so much gone soft as solidified, like something that used to move and had calcified in place. He had a face that had arranged itself over decades into an expression of permanent mild offense, the expression of someone who believed the world was conducting itself just slightly below the standard it owed him. "Potter," he said, and Granger. The pause before her name was just barely present, just long enough to be intentional. "Mr. Selwyn," Harry said, "what can we do for you?" Selwyn's solicitor opened his document case. "The Selwyn family wishes to formally register its claim." "No," Harry said. The solicitor stopped mid-sentence. "I beg your pardon, I said no." Harry looked at him with complete equanimity. "I'm not trying to be rude, but we've been informed this claim was coming, and I'd rather not spend 40 minutes on the formal reading of documents that reach the same conclusion. So no." Selwyn's face went through several interesting configurations. "The Selwyn family has contributed to this institution since." "I'm sure it has," Harry said, "and the school is grateful. The gates are open to every student who qualifies and every alumnus who comes to help with reconstruction. But the magical governance of Hogwarts is not a hereditary entitlement, and it's not something we're accepting claims against." "We," Selwyn said, and the word came out with a texture on it. "On what authority do you claim?" "The castle," Hermione said. "On the authority of the castle, which made its choice 4 days ago in a way that 16 ministry representatives and 5 faculty members witnessed. You're welcome to contest it. There isn't a magical court in Britain with the jurisdiction to hear that case, but you're welcome to try." Selwyn looked at her with an expression that had moved past mild offense into something more focused. "Miss Granger," he said, "I want to be clear that I have no personal objection to your involvement in the reconstruction effort. You are clearly and extremely capable. If the next word is girl or student or muggle-born, I'd rethink it," she said mildly. It wasn't either of those words. He recovered with the smoothness of practice and said which instead, and it cost him something. She could see him calculating in real time. "Extremely capable which," he said. "The concern is not personal. The concern is what signal this sends. Hogwarts has a particular character, a particular tradition that has been maintained across 1,000 years of—" "It has," Hermione agreed. "It's been maintained by admitting every magically capable child regardless of blood status, by teaching a curriculum that covers magical theory and practice across all traditions, and by having 4 different houses that represent 4 different values rather than a single hierarchical ideal. That tradition, she said, looking at him steadily, is exactly what Harry and I intend to maintain. Selwyn studied her for a long moment. His sons were behind him, quiet, one of them with an expression she couldn't fully read. The solicitor had closed his document case. "This isn't finished," Selwyn said to Harry, which was a deliberate choice about who he was addressing. "It's not," Harry agreed. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Selwyn." The family left. The solicitor went last, glancing back at Hermione with an expression that was less hostile than calculating, which she found more interesting. Harry waited until they were far enough away and then said, "That went well." "He's going to work with Thorn," she said immediately. "Obviously, the solicitor is cleverer than the rest of them. I noticed. And the younger son," she nodded in the direction of the now distant group. "Second from the left, he wasn't with them really, he was watching us." Harry was quiet for a moment, watching us like he was sizing us up or watching us like something else. "I'm not sure yet." She looked back at the castle gates. "But he'll be back. They'll all be back." Harry turned, started walking back toward the grounds and the reconstruction work they'd left. After 2 steps he said without turning, "You didn't let him finish his sentence." He was going to say something condescending. "You don't know that. I always know that." She heard the breath that wasn't quite a laugh and kept walking. What happened 3 days later was not something either of them could have predicted, which Hermione found professionally irritating and professionally instructive in equal measure. The attempt came in the late evening, while the reconstruction teams had cleared out, and the castle was down to its resident population of ghosts, portraits, and the handful of faculty who were staying during the rebuild. It came not through the gates or any physical entrance but through the magical substrate, a deep lateral push against the ward structure, the kind that didn't announce itself as an attack because it was technically a legal instrument, a magical charter, a document of governance submitted by the Selwyn family's solicitor to the ministry and magically registered, which attempted to claim a stake in Hogwarts' foundational wards through the same mechanism by which a landlord might register a claim against a property. Harry felt it before Hermione did, which made sense given what they now understood about their respective connections to the castle. He woke from something that wasn't quite sleep with the specific sensation of someone pushing against a locked door, not breaking, not forcing, but persistent and purposeful. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, and in the corridor before he'd consciously decided to move, and Hermione was already there because she'd felt it 3 seconds after him and had the same instinct. They stood in the corridor in the late-night dark, both slightly underdressed for the September chill, and the castle was humming around them with a quality of low-level alarm that Hermione could feel in the walls and Harry could feel in the wards, and neither of them said anything for about 4 seconds. "Legal instrument," she said, "not a direct attack. Can you feel it in the internal structure?" "Yes, it's trying to anchor at the foundation points, the spots where the original wards are deepest." She pressed her hand against the nearest wall, which was something she'd started doing instinctively and had stopped analyzing. The information the castle returned was textual and spatial all at once, a kind of knowing rather than a data transfer. 3 points, trying to establish concurrent claims. If the claims register, they would give the Selwyn family legal standing in any Wisengamot proceeding about the castle's governance. It's not control, but it's a foot in the door, and with Thorn's proposed oversight committee. Right. Harry closed his eyes for a moment, and Hermione could see him finding the wall the document was pressing against, locating the exact geometry of the attack in the ward sense he'd developed. Then he said, "I can push it back, but it'll just re-register tomorrow." "Not if we change the foundation points." He opened his eyes. "Can we do that?" "We can do better than that." She turned and started walking toward the room of requirement, the circular room which she'd taken to thinking of as the founder's chamber in her notes. "We're not going to push the document back, we're going to make it irrelevant." He followed her and the castle's alarm hum eased slightly, and Hermione thought briefly, peripherally in the part of her mind that tracked things without making them into issues, that the castle calmed faster when they were moving together than when either of them moved alone. In the founder's chamber, both chairs lit immediately and completely, the way lamps catch when the source is nearby. The runic glyphs were bright. Hermione sat and put both hands on the arms of the black walnut chair and let the castle's structural awareness open fully through her, which was a process she'd been practicing over the past several days and which got less disorienting each time. The foundation points were clear to her now, 5 of them deep in the castle's structure, the original anchors of Founder's magic that the legal document was trying to attach to. She could see, not visually but with a precision that functioned like sight, what the Selwyn instrument was trying to do. It was elegant, actually legally imaginative. The solicitor was clever, not clever enough. She began to rewrite the anchoring structure of the foundation points, not moving them, that would have been crude and disruptive, transforming them. The legal instrument was trying to attach to a specific magical configuration that was technically still structured in its original 1,000-year-old form, which meant it was, in a theoretical sense, up for historical claim. She was not going to argue against the claim, she was going to update the structure. Living magic could be updated, that was the difference the founders had built in, the elegance of it. The castle was designed to grow. The original founders' magic had not been a fossil but a... "Harry," she said without opening her eyes, I need you to reinforce the perimeter wards at the same time, not the outer walls, the internal perimeter, the layer that separates Hogwarts' magical sovereignty from ministry jurisdiction. What am I looking for? The places where the boundary is unclear, where the legal definition overlaps. You'll feel them as gaps, he said, like holes in a fence. Exactly, close them, not aggressively, just make them definite, unambiguous. She heard him sit in the ash chair and felt the ward consciousness shift alongside her structural awareness, two different systems of the same castle moving in coordination. And for a moment the sensation was so complete, so much like two instruments finding the same key, that she lost her place in the foundation work and had to find it again. She found it, she did the work. It took 40 minutes, and it required the kind of sustained magical attention that left her hands shaking slightly after, the visible indication of significant effort that she generally preferred not to show but was willing to allow in private. When it was done, the legal document's 3 anchor points simply had nothing to attach to. The structure they'd been written against no longer existed in the form they required. The instrument wasn't refused or rejected, it was just meaningless. It was like serving notice on a door that had become a wall. She became aware as she came fully back to the room that Harry was watching her, not in the way that usually followed magical effort, not assessing, not checking if she was all right, though both of those were in there, something different, the look a person gets when they've seen something that has moved what they'd believed was a fixed point. What? She said. He looked away, looked at his hands. Nothing, a beat, that was, don't say extraordinary. I wasn't going to say extraordinary. What were you going to say? He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say you. He seemed to find this slightly awkward once it was out in the open, which she found endearing in a way she also chose not to say. Like it was very much you, precise and complete, and he shook his head slightly. Never mind. No, finish it. He looked up and the gold from the glyphs was in his eyes and he said, like watching someone be entirely themselves. Entirely right in what they are. A pause. I don't have better words than that. Hermione was quiet for 3 seconds longer than was probably neutral. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I will in a moment. He stood, stretched, and moved toward the door. He stopped in the frame and looked back at her in the light of the glowing room and said, Hermione, what you're building here, what we're building, it's going to be worth everything they throw at us. She looked at him in the ash chair's light, in the room that knew them, and felt something she didn't immediately try to name move through her with the solidity of something that had been there for a while and was only now being acknowledged. I know, she said, go to sleep. He smiled, and it was the real one, the one that reached all the way up, and then he was gone, his footsteps quiet down the corridor, and the castle settled around her like a contented exhalation, and Hermione sat in her chair in the warm gold light and let herself feel for just a moment what she usually kept catalogued at a careful distance. She pressed her palm flat against the arm of the black walnut chair. The wood was warm. The rune for foundation glowed beneath her hand. She thought, there is so much still coming. Thorn and his committees, the Selwyns and their lawyers, and whatever Kingsley hadn't told them about the Death Eater remnants that his expression had been guarding all afternoon. She thought, let it come. The chair was solid beneath her, and the castle was awake around her, and the ash chair on her right was still faintly warm from Harry, and Hermione Granger sat in the middle of all of it and was not afraid, not even slightly. Chapter 3. What the castle remembers. The memory came to Harry on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into the reconstruction, while he was eating breakfast alone in the kitchen. Not his memory, the castle's. He'd been sitting at the long prep table with a bowl of porridge and McGonagall's latest reconstruction schedule, reading through it with one hand and eating with the other, when the sensation arrived without warning, not a vision, not a dream, something more like being told something in a language he hadn't known he spoke. The kitchen dissolved around him and he was somewhere else entirely, standing in the castle as it had been, and standing wasn't even the right word because he had no body, he was simply present, a consciousness inside stone watching. It was early. Pre-dawn, possibly the first dawn that had ever happened in this particular configuration of walls. 4 people in the room that would become the Great Hall. The hall wasn't finished yet, scaffolding still visible along one side, fresh plaster drying in the cold September air that was identical in temperature to the September air of the present, 1,000 years later. 4 people who were not yet founders in the historical sense, who were just 4 wizards who had been arguing for 6 months about everything and had kept building anyway. Harry watched them with the strange double awareness of borrowed memory. He could not hear their words clearly, the way you can't always hear clearly in your own dreams, but he could feel the emotional texture of the scene with absolute precision. The tall woman with dark red hair was frustrated, gesturing at a section of wall, and the small man with a scholar's narrow shoulders and quick hands was explaining something she wasn't accepting, and the broad-shouldered woman with earth on her boots was laughing at both of them, and the fourth, lean and pale and sharp-eyed, standing slightly apart, was watching all 3 of them with an expression that Harry recognized with a jolt of something almost like kinship. He was watching his people. Not approvingly, not with affection necessarily, but with the particular alertness of someone who has decided, against their own better judgment, to trust. Then the memory shifted. The hall was finished. Students, dozens of them, the first Hogwarts students, eating at tables that had not yet been separated by house because the house system was still being argued about. The castle was alive in a way Harry could feel even within the memory, humming, responding, extending its awareness through every corridor and classroom the way a new creature extends its senses into unfamiliar territory, learning itself, becoming, and then it shifted again and Harry was in the Chamber of Secrets, except it wasn't the Chamber of Secrets, not yet. It was a room that was being deliberately constructed beneath the school's foundations, and the lean man with the sharp eyes was down there alone, carving runes into the walls with a precision that made Hermione's inscription work look like rough drafting. Harry watched him work for what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. The memory had no reliable duration, and he understood with the castle's own understanding what was being built, not a chamber for a basilisk. That had come later, been added later, been Slytherin's darkest addition to a space that had been built for something else entirely. The original room had been built to house something Slytherin had hidden from the other 3 founders, something he had decided was too dangerous to be shared but too important to be destroyed. Something he had sealed with runes so specific and layered that even Hermione's most sophisticated ward analysis hadn't detected their presence beneath the basilisk's subsequent additions. Harry came back to the kitchen with the particular disorientation of having been simultaneously somewhere else and exactly where he was, and his porridge was cold, and the reconstruction schedule had fallen on the floor, and he sat very still for a moment with both hands flat on the table, feeling the castle solid beneath his feet. Then he went to find Hermione. She was in her study room, which he'd stopped knocking on the door of 2 weeks ago because she always said come in before he finished knocking anyway. She was surrounded by texts she'd requested from the restricted section, several she'd owled for from the British Library of Magical Archives, and one that he was fairly certain she'd written herself in the past fortnight and was now citing as a primary source, which was either academic fraud or impressive efficiency depending on how you looked at it. She looked up when he came in, read his face in the way she always read his face and put her quill down. "Sit," she said, and pushed a stack of books to one side to clear the chair across from her. He sat and told her about the memory, not haltingly, not searching for words, just delivered it cleanly the way she'd taught him years ago to organize things he needed her to understand quickly. All of it, the construction memory, the original hall, the chamber, the runes, the things Slytherin had hidden. She was quiet for 4 seconds when he finished. "Slytherin's original construction predates the chamber additions by how long?" she said, and she was already pulling a specific text toward her, already beginning. "I don't know exactly, decades I think." The memory wasn't precise about time, but it was definitely separate, 2 distinct construction phases, completely different. Different materials in the runes, different intent in the carving. The later stuff, the basilisk infrastructure, was aggressive, almost angry. The original room was careful, very careful, like hiding something precious. She was writing, her quill moved fast, and you couldn't tell what was hidden, not from the memory, just that it mattered. It felt, he searched for a word, it felt like the thing he couldn't let go of even when he left, even when the whole founder situation collapsed. Whatever it is, it was important enough that he built a room under school to keep it safe. He paused. "Salazar Slytherin did not strike me from what I saw of him as someone who kept things safe out of sentiment." Hermione looked up from her notes. Her expression was the specific one that meant she'd already leapt 3 steps ahead and was deciding which one to share first. It could be knowledge, a specific body of magical theory he'd developed that he didn't trust the others with. It could be an object, it could be, she stopped herself. "We need to go down there, we need to go down there," he agreed, "without triggering anything that we then have to explain to McGonagall, or the Ministry, definitely without explaining to the Ministry." She capped her inkpot. Tonight, we should tell Ron." Harry considered this. "We should tell Ron," he agreed, because Ron had been at Hogwarts for the past week helping with the reconstruction. It was part of what he was doing with the post-war shapelessness of his life. Finding useful things to be present for and not telling him felt both practically unwise and personally wrong. "He'll want to come, obviously." "Good." She stood up, began reorganizing her reference text in the way that meant she was actually thinking about something else entirely. "Harry. The memories, does the castle just give them to you or can you ask?" He thought about it honestly. "It's more like I ask by wondering and it answers if it has something relevant." He paused, like talking to someone who only speaks in experience rather than words. She looked at him with an expression he was seeing more frequently, one that he'd tentatively categorized as surprised by him and was unsure how to feel about. "That's a very sophisticated observation." "I do occasionally have those. I know." She said it simply, without the ironic edge it might have carried years ago when they were still in the habit of underestimating each other. "I know you do." The room was quiet for a moment in a way that was slightly different from regular quiet, and Harry found something to look at on the bookshelf. "Tonight then," he said. "Tonight," she confirmed. Ron took the news with characteristic directness, which is to say he sat with it for 30 seconds, made a face that cycled through surprise, interest and resignation in rapid succession, and then said, "Of course there's something in the Chamber of Secrets. Why wouldn't there be? I just got here." They were in the 7th-floor corridor where Ron had been working on the armor restoration, and the afternoon light was doing something complicated through the repaired windows. Hermione had finished the ward work on this section 2 days ago, and the castle had immediately begun assisting its own restoration, which was the most extraordinary thing Harry had seen since the activation, stones shifting back into alignment with a dreamy slow-motion purposefulness that made the whole corridor feel slightly under. "You don't have to come," Harry said. "No, I'm coming." Ron set down the helmet he'd been trying to reattach to a suit of armor that was determinedly resistant to reunion with its own head. "I just want it noted that I called this. Something always happens in the chamber." "Noted," Hermione said. "And if there's anything still alive down there, the basilisk is dead," Harry said. "Has been for 4 years. You say that like it rules things out. It does rule things out." "It rules out that specific basilisk," Ron said. "It does not rule out things." Hermione opened her mouth, closed it, and appeared to make a decision not to engage with the metaphysics of this. "We go tonight after the last reconstruction team leaves at 7. We take proper illumination charms, full ward scanning equipment, and we don't touch anything we can't identify." "And if we find something that can't be identified?" Harry asked. "Then I identify it," she said, and went back to her notes. Ron watched her go and then looked at Harry with an expression Harry had learned to read over 7 years, the expression that meant Ron was perceiving something and calculating whether to say it. "She's different," Ron said quietly. "Everyone's different," Harry said. "Not like that." Ron picked up the helmet again, turned it over in his hands. "She's always been brilliant. He paused. "This is like watching someone who's always been the most capable person in the room realize that the room doesn't have a ceiling." He glanced at Harry sideways. "You too, for that matter." Harry didn't say anything. "You're not going to comment on that?" Ron asked. "Not particularly, no." Ron made the face again, the cycling one, and let it go. "Tonight, then." The Chamber of Secrets smelled like old stone and something biological that was almost but not entirely gone. The basilisk's presence, still faintly present in the scale-pattern floor, and the structural adaptation of the room to something very large that had lived there for centuries. The torches that Harry had lit on his last visit 4 years ago were long dead, and the chamber came alive only with the illumination they brought with them. 3 wand lights and a floating orb that Hermione had set running a continuous scanning charm that painted the space in faint diagnostic light. The basilisk's body was gone. Something had removed it in the aftermath of the battle, or in the years before, Harry wasn't sure when, and the chamber was just a space now vast and cold and architecturally extraordinary, the vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, the serpentine pillars rising like the world's most sinister forest. "First time without wanting to throw up," Ron said, looking around. "I'm counting that as progress." "The original runes should be beneath these," Hermione said, moving her wand along the base of the nearest pillar. The diagnostic charm pulsed. She crouched, examined the readout, looked up. "Harry, you said the original construction was beneath the basilisk additions. How far beneath?" Harry closed his eyes, reaching for the castle's awareness the way he'd been practicing. The chamber felt different from the rest of Hogwarts, older, more complex, like a room inside a room, the basilisk's century of habitation sitting over the original space like sediment. "But beneath that, beneath all of it, at the very base of the walls, the floor," he said, and opened his eyes. "The original room is below the current floor level." Hermione stood up. "Slytherin built down. He built a room inside the chamber's foundation. The current chamber is like a disguise. The original space is below." Ron looked at the floor looked back. "There's a phrase I don't enjoy," he said. "Inside the foundation, like behind the mirror or beneath the stairs. These phrases never lead anywhere good." "Stand back," Hermione said, and she dropped to one knee and pressed both palms flat against the floor, and the castle connection opened through her like light through glass. And Harry watched her find the seam between the 2 construction periods, the fault line between Slytherin's careful original work and the aggressive renovation. And then she did something with the ward structure that he could feel more than see, a precise, surgical unmaking of the overlaid magic, not destroying but separating. Peeling back the later work to reveal what was underneath, a section of the floor dissolved. Not dramatically, it became transparent first, then absent, revealing a descending passage cut from the bedrock, narrow and steep and lit from below by something that was not torchfire. Blue light, ancient, steady, and clearly not extinguished in 1,000 years. "Right," Ron said. "Blue light from the secret room beneath the Chamber of Secrets, very normal." They went down. The passage was tight enough that they went single file, Hermione first, because she'd opened it, Harry behind her, Ron last with his wand providing light from the rear. The steps were Slytherin's original work, cut with the precision Harry had seen in the memory, perfectly even, the walls to either side covered in the dense runic script that Hermione was reading as she descended, her free hand trailing along the wall and her lips moving slightly. "What does it say?" Harry asked from behind her. "Give me a moment." "We have a moment." "Harry," he waited. The blue light grew as they descended. The room at the bottom was small. Smaller than the founder's chamber, smaller than most classrooms, perhaps 20 feet across, perfectly circular, with walls of solid bedrock covered entirely in runes and a ceiling low enough that Harry and Ron both ducked slightly on reflex. The blue light came from a single object in the center of the room, sitting on a plinth of natural stone that rose from the floor as though it had always been there. A book, not remarkable in size, folio format, roughly the dimensions of a large atlas, bound in something that was neither leather nor cloth, a material Harry had never seen, dark green-black with a sheen that moved when the light hit it. It lay open to approximately its midpoint, and the pages were covered in Slytherin's runic script, smaller and denser than the walls, and it glowed with the same blue light that had guided them down, steady and deliberate and clearly aware of their arrival in the way that magical objects sometimes were. "Don't touch it yet," Hermione said immediately, though no one had moved. She was already scanning it, the diagnostic charm spinning a complex readout that she was reading with the intense focus of someone eating something extraordinary slowly. "It's warded extensively," but she paused. "The wards aren't defensive, they're not meant to prevent access." They're another pause longer. "They're selective, they're keyed to something specific." "What something?" Ron asked. "Founder recognition," Hermione said slowly. "The ward requires the magical signature of someone the castle has recognized as having founder standing." She looked up and directly at Harry. "The castle activated the ward the moment you came down those steps." Harry stepped toward the plinth. Nothing resisted him. The blue light, if anything, intensified slightly. He looked at the book. He didn't pick it up. It was open, and the open pages were clearly significant, but he leaned forward and looked at the text, and the runes he was looking at were not immediately readable to him. He looked at Hermione. "Give me a moment," she said, appearing at his shoulder, and began reading. She read for a long time, long enough that Ron found a piece of floor that wasn't visibly horrifying, sat down against the wall, and ate 2 of the biscuits he apparently carried in his jacket pocket. Long enough that Harry sat on the edge of the plinth and thought about what the memory had shown him, Slytherin working down here alone, carving with precision, hiding something precious. The room felt, Harry thought, like a held breath, like something that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, the way the castle had been waiting for them and had finally, after a very long time, received whatever answer it had been waiting for. "Harry," Hermione said, and her voice was quiet and absolutely taut. He stood up. "What is it?" "It's a foundational text." She was still looking at the pages. Her hand was hovering over the book without touching it. "Not a spell book, not a theoretical treatise, it's the original design, the original intention. Slytherin wrote down what Hogwarts was supposed to be, what all 4 of them agreed on before." She stopped. "Before the split," Harry said. "Before the split." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the blue light, and doing the thing they did when something enormous had just happened in her understanding of things. He hid it because what happened between them, the arguments, the schism, the things history recorded, he knew it would be used to justify things he hadn't meant and hadn't agreed to. So he wrote down what they'd actually decided together before everything went wrong, and he hid it somewhere no one could reach it without the castle's recognition. She looked back at the book. Without someone the castle had specifically chosen. Ron had stopped eating his biscuit. What did it say they agreed on? Hermione turned back to the text. She read for another minute, making sure, and then said that Hogwarts was for every child with magic. Not every child with the right blood or the right family or the right amount of power. Every child. That the education would be free because knowledge could not be a commodity without becoming a weapon. That the school would protect its students from external power, ministry, monarchy, church, whoever held institutional authority, because children needed a place where they were safe from the politics of adults. She paused. And that the 4 founders would never, collectively, put their personal beliefs above the needs of the students. The room was quiet. "He hid that," Ron said after a moment. "Slytherin specifically hid the document that said Hogwarts was for everyone, because he knew," Harry said slowly, "that what he'd come to believe about Muggle-borns was wrong, and he couldn't undo it. He'd already broken with the others, already started his campaign. It had its own momentum. But he couldn't destroy this either. So he preserved it," Hermione said, "for later, for when there was someone to find it." She looked at Harry. "For when the castle found someone to give it to." Harry looked at the book. He thought about the sharp-eyed man in the memory, standing slightly apart from the others, watching them with the alertness of someone deciding to trust against his own judgment. He thought about how history had recorded Salazar Slytherin as purely the villain of the founding, the anti-Muggle-born zealot, and how history, as Hermione had noted many times, was written by whoever controlled the records. He thought, this changes things. Not everything, not the harm that had been done in Slytherin's name, but something. "We need to take this to McGonagall," he said. "Yes." Hermione gently, carefully, with the specific reverence she reserved for things that were both ancient and fragile, closed the book. The blue light faded as she did, the room going entirely dark except for their wand lights, and the book ceased glowing and became simply an object, remarkable in its binding but no longer announcing itself. She tucked it under her arm. "And then we need to think very carefully about how to use it." "Thorn," Harry said. She met his eyes. "Thorn," she confirmed. "If this document goes public, it changes the entire legal and historical argument he's building on. The hereditary entitlement argument, the founder's original intent argument, the argument for restricting Hogwarts too." She paused. "It dismantles all of it. The original text predates every interpretation that's been used to justify restriction and exclusion. If Slytherin himself wrote in his own hand before the schism," she stopped again. He could see her working through the implications at speed, which was always slightly extraordinary to watch. This is why the castle wanted us to find it. The timing is convenient, Ron said, getting to his feet. Magical things often are, Hermione said. That's how you know they're magical. McGonagall read the translated sections Hermione provided with an expression of complete stillness that Harry had learned to read as profound emotion held with iron discipline. When she finished, she set the parchment down on her desk and looked out the window at the grounds, which were looking better. The castle's self-restoration, now that the wards were properly active, had accelerated visibly in the past week. The grounds crew had reported that the grass was growing back in places it had burned, and that the Whomping Willow, which had sustained significant damage, was very aggressively recovering. This document, McGonagall said, changes several things. No, Hermione said. Thorn's proposal to the Wizengamot includes historical arguments that this directly contradicts. I know, he will say it's a forgery. He can say that. Hermione's voice was even. He'll need to explain how a forgery was sealed with Founder's magic that only activated for someone the castle itself recognized and has been sitting in a warded chamber beneath Hogwarts since the school was built, untouched by anyone for 1,000 years. He can make that argument. I look forward to watching him make it. McGonagall looked at her, and something in the headmistress's expression shifted into a territory that was not quite a smile but was its serious cousin. You intend to go public with this? We intend to go public with this, Harry said, but we want to do it right, not defensively, not as a reaction to Thorn's Wizengamot proposal. We want to do it before, we want to set the terms. A formal presentation, McGonagall said. A formal presentation, Hermione confirmed. At Hogwarts, on our ground, on our terms, with the book present and the castle's recognition on record. Kingsley, the Wizengamot members who aren't compromised, the press. She paused. And Thorn, we invite Thorn specifically. Why? Ron asked from his chair in the corner. Because not inviting him makes us look like we're hiding from him. Inviting him and having this conversation publicly on the record makes him the one who has to decide whether to contest historical evidence in front of the whole wizarding world. Ron considered this. That's kind of ruthless. Yes, Hermione said simply. Harry was looking at her, and the thing he felt was not surprise. He'd seen Hermione be strategically ruthless before, had watched her execute complex plans with a cold precision that people who only knew her as the earnest student sometimes missed. But it was something adjacent to pride that had a warmth to it he was increasingly failing to successfully categorize as just friendship. 2 weeks, he said to McGonagall. We can be ready in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, McGonagall said, we'll also have a functioning Great Hall again. The structural restoration should be complete. She looked at the book, still resting on Hermione's side of the desk where she'd placed it. I'll send the invitations. What happened the following night, and Hermione would later be unable to say precisely when she'd stopped being surprised by things happening in the night at Hogwarts, was not Thorn, it was Isolde Caro. Harry felt her at the perimeter in the same instant. He felt the wards fracture along the east wall, not the clean legal pressure of the Selwyn document but something physical and violent. A sharp crack in the ward structure that sent a burst of sensation up his spine like a struck tuning fork. He was out of his bed and out of his room before the feeling fully processed, his wand in his hand, moving fast and silent in the way that 5 years of survival had built into his nervous system. Hermione was in the corridor. She had apparently had the same instinct from the internal structure side, felt the breach differently than he had, felt it as a rupture in the castle's living enchantments, and had the same zero-to-moving response time that Harry recognized as a person who had stopped sleeping deeply long before the war ended. East Wall, he said without preamble. I know, she said. 3 people outside the breach, not the main force if there is one, a scouting party. Testing. Testing, she confirmed, and looking at something specific. They moved along the east wall before they broke through. They were following the ward structure, looking for something. Looking for the chamber access, Harry said, and they were already moving. The east corridor of the dungeons was dark and cold and had the particular oppressive silence of a space that knew something wrong was in it. Harry kept his wand light off by instinct, combat instinct, night instinct, the knowledge that darkness favored the person who knew the terrain. He knew this terrain. He had been mapping it with the castle's own awareness for weeks. He felt them before he saw them, 3 figures at the junction of the dungeon corridor and the hidden passage that Hermione had used to enter the chamber the night before. They'd found the opening, or found where it had been since Hermione had closed and rewarded it on their way out. They were working at the space with a methodical precision that suggested specific knowledge of what they were looking for, which meant they knew about the chamber access, which meant they had information. Harry stepped around the corner and hit all 3 of them with simultaneous binding spells before any of them had registered his presence. It was not a complex action. It was very fast and very precise, and it required the kind of 3-dimensional spatial awareness under pressure that was simply how Harry's magic operated in a fight. No strategy, no dramatic announcement, just the assessment of a situation and the resolution of it, conducted in the time it took most people to identify that a situation existed. All 3 went down. One of them managed half a syllable of a countercurse before the second binding hit and closed the conversation. Hermione came around the corner behind him and looked at the three bound figures on the dungeon floor and said, "That was faster than last time. Last time I was 17. You were excellent at 17. I'm better now." She crouched beside the nearest figure, a man Harry didn't recognize, mid-30s, with the Death Eater tattoo visible on his forearm in the light she'd produced from her wand, and performed a careful identification charm. "Thaddeus Byrne," she said. "Wanted by the Aura office for 6 counts of use of unforgivables during the occupation." She moved to the second. "Marcus Pelton, 4 counts, fled Britain in May and apparently came back." The third figure she examined for a longer moment. "This one is interesting. Who?" "His name is Fenwick Selwyn." She looked up. "Second son of Cassian Selwyn, the one I said was watching us at the gate." Harry looked at him. Late 20s, lean, with a face that combined his father's jawline with something sharper and more private. He was conscious. Unlike the other two, the binding had taken his body but not his awareness, and he was watching them with an expression that was not fear, it was calculation. "You're not a Death Eater," Harry said to him, not a question. Fenwick Selwyn's mouth tightened very slightly. "Your father is working with Thorn," Hermione said. "You know about the chamber. You're here with 2 wanted criminals. But you're not afraid and you're not one of them." She tilted her head. "What are you looking for?" Selwyn looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Something that my family has been trying to find for a very long time. Something that belongs to— It doesn't belong to Hogwarts. It was placed here for retrieval." "By whom?" Harry asked. "An ancestor." A pause. "I'm not going to tell you more than that tonight." "You're going to tell the Aura office in the morning," Harry said. Selwyn looked at him with an expression that was doing something complicated. Not hostile, not resigned, more like someone engaged in a negotiation whose terms they haven't fully revealed yet. "Do you know what's in the chamber?" he asked. "What was originally in the chamber before the basilisk?" Neither Harry nor Hermione responded immediately, and the absence of denial in that silence was apparently answer enough, because Selwyn nodded once slowly. "Then you understand," he said, "why my family wants it back." "We understand," Hermione said carefully, "that your family is claiming ownership of something that's been in Hogwarts Foundation for 1,000 years. Not ownership," and his voice had changed just slightly, something real in it now underneath the calculation. "Protection, something that needs protecting." He looked between them both. "The people who broke that ward with me, they were hired help. I'm not with Caro, I'm not with Thorn. I'm trying to get to whatever's in that room before they do." The dungeon was quiet for a moment. Harry looked at Hermione. She was reading Selwyn with the focused attention she brought to text. She was deciding whether to trust, checking the internal consistency, looking for the places where the logic held or broke. "We'll talk in the morning," she said. "All 3 of you are going to the Aura office at dawn. You can tell your story there." She stood up. "But if you're telling the truth, if there's something else in that room and there are people who want it for the wrong reasons," she met his eyes and her voice was level and very clear. "We'll find out before they do." Selwyn held her gaze. Something in his expression settled, like a decision reached. "I know," he said. "That's why I came here first." The dungeon torches caught, all of them at once, the castle responding to the intruder's presence with a low, alert illumination, and Hermione and Harry stood in the amber light with 3 bound figures at their feet and the chamber sealed beneath them. And the castle hummed around them with the particular quality of a very old building that had seen many things, and was watching something new unfold with what might, in something less ancient, have been called interest. Harry looked at Hermione across the bound figures between them. "Something else in the room," he said. "Something Slytherin put there before the book," she said. "Or alongside it, something a family has been trying to retrieve for a very long time." She looked at the sealed chamber entrance. "We were wrong. The book wasn't the only thing he hid down there." What was the other thing? She was already thinking. He could see it happening, the rapid architecture, the building of hypotheses from limited data, the specific light in her eyes that meant she was several steps ahead of the evidence and running toward it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but we're going to find out." She reached over and picked up the wand that had rolled from Fenwick Selwyn's hand when the binding hit, held it for a moment, examining it in the torchlight. "Harry," she said, not looking up from the wand. "Yeah. Whatever Isolde Caro is looking for, she'll be back with more than 3 people." "I know. And Thorn's Wisengamot proposal is in 9 days." "I know." She looked up. Her eyes were steady in the torchlight, and she was not afraid. He'd gotten very attuned to the precise quality of Hermione Granger's fearlessness, which was not the absence of risk awareness but something that coexisted with it, something that looked at the full ledger of what was coming and did not flinch. He found it, as he always had, the most reliable thing in his world. "We're going to be busy," she said. "Good," Harry said, and he meant it. The castle agreed. Chapter 4. The first battle the morning after the dungeon incident was loud in ways that had nothing to do with noise. Kingsley arrived at 8 with 2 auras and the specific expression of a man who had been awake since 3 and was holding himself together with professional discipline and strong tea. He took Byrne and Pelton into custody with the brisk efficiency of someone ticking items off a list, and he took Fenwick Selwyn with a careful formality that suggested Selwyn's family name was making things complicated in ways that wouldn't be resolved quickly. Selwyn went without resistance, which Harry noted, and looked back at Hermione as he crossed the gate threshold with the expression of a man who had said what he meant and was prepared to wait. Hermione watched him go with her arms crossed, and the look she got when she was holding multiple unresolved problems at once and had decided to table them in order of urgency. "He's not wrong about Caro coming back," Harry said. "No," she turned from the gate. "Kingsley, before you go." Kingsley paused, handed his documentation to one of the auras and came to stand with them at the gate with the deliberate attention of a man setting aside bureaucracy temporarily. "What do you need?" "Caro's file," Harry said. "Everything the aura office has on her movement since May. That's restricted. We were attacked at Hogwarts last night," Harry said. "By people in her network. This is our ground, Kingsley. We need to know what's coming at it." A pause, during which Kingsley did the mental calculation Harry could see him doing: political cost versus practical necessity, institutional protocol versus the reality that the two people in front of him had just incapacitated 3 intruders in a dungeon at midnight and were asking for information rather than backup. "I'll have it to you by noon," he said, and went. McGonagall appeared at the castle doors as the auras left, looked at the gate and then at Harry and Hermione and said, "Breakfast first, then you can explain everything." They explained everything over breakfast in McGonagall's office, which had been restored to nearly its full pre-war state, the portraits of previous headmasters alert and opinionated along the walls, Dumbledore's frame conspicuously present and conspicuously quiet in the way that Dumbledore was quiet when he was listening rather than sleeping. And they finished, including the part about Fenwick Selwyn's claim that something else was hidden in the chamber's original room. McGonagall was quiet for a moment and then said, "The presentation at the Great Hall is in 9 days. "Yes," Hermione said. "And you believe Caro will move before then?" "She was testing the perimeter last night," Harry said. 3 people, specific target, specific knowledge of the ward's structure. That's reconnaissance, not an assault. She's building towards something larger." He paused. "The question is what she wants badly enough to attack Hogwarts directly." "The book," Hermione said, "or whatever else is in the chamber. She has Selwyn information through the family, through the solicitor, through someone. She knows something is down there. And if she gets to it before the presentation," McGonagall started. "She won't," Harry said simply. Dumbledore's portrait spoke for the first time, which was his habit, waiting until a conversation had developed its own logic before entering it. A patience that Harry had once found manipulative and now found, with the mellowing of several years and several significant survivals, merely characteristic. "Harry," the portrait said, "the speed with which you've both grown into this, the castle's recognition, the ward work, the instinctive coordination." A pause, and something moved through the painted face that the portrait, to its credit, did not try to dress up. "I am very proud of you both, and I am very sorry I am not here to see it as more than paint and memory." Harry looked at the portrait for a moment. "You saw most of it," he said, "in your way. I saw potential. I saw what you might become." The portrait's eyes, which had always been unnervingly accurate, moved between Harry and Hermione. "This is something else. This is what potential looks like when it decides." A slight pause with the old quality of humor underneath. "I'm also, if it is useful, very obvious to dead men, the things that are clear from this vantage point." "Albus," McGonagall said with a precision that meant not now. "Quite right," the portrait said serenely and returned to looking benevolent. Harry looked at Hermione. She was looking at her tea. Her ears were, he thought, slightly pink, though that could have been the morning light. "We need to go back into the chamber," she said to the room generally. "Today, before Caro makes another move." They went back in the afternoon, just the two of them this time, because Ron had flew to the burrow for what he described as a family thing, and what Harry suspected was George needing him. Harry didn't push it. Ron's grief ran on its own schedule and George's ran on a different one, and the way they helped each other with it was not something anyone else needed to manage. Hermione opened the chamber passage with the same surgical ease as before, which was faster this time, practice, Harry thought, and the castle's increasing responsiveness to both of them. The steps and the blue light and the circular room at the bottom, and the plinth with the book still on it, and this time Hermione moved past it immediately and began a slow circumnavigation of the room with her wand out and the diagnostic charm running. Harry stood at the center and reached for the castle's memory of this space. It came differently than the first memory, less visual, more textural, like the castle offering what it knew of the room through sensation rather than image. What he felt was the room as Slytherin had left it, the book on the plinth, yes, but also a second presence that wasn't spatial, wasn't an object in the normal sense, more like an impression in the room's fabric, a record, something that had been present here for so long that it had become part of the room's identity. He opened his eyes. "It's not an object," he said. Hermione stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "Whatever Selwyn was trying to reach. It's not a thing you can pick up." He looked at the walls, at the dense runic script covering every surface. "It's in the writing, encoded in the runes." She turned immediately back to the walls with an expression of arrested attention. She went to the wall directly opposite the plinth and placed her palm flat against it, and her eyes went the way they went when she was reading very fast, skimming for structure before committing to detail. "Oh," she said. "What?" "It's a memory." She moved her hand along the wall slowly. "Not a pensive memory, something more primitive, more direct." Slytherin encoded a memory into the runic structure of the room, his own memory, a specific one. She followed the writing around the curve of the wall, reading continuously, her free hand pulling her notebook from her robe pocket and writing one-handed without looking at the page, which was a skill Harry had always found impressive and slightly alarming. It's the memory of the founding, the original agreement. Not just the written record that's in the book, the actual memory of the four of them making it. She stopped. Harry, it's a witness record. He left a memory of himself as a witness to what they agreed. Harry understood immediately. So you can't argue forgery. You can't argue forgery, you can't argue misinterpretation, you can't argue that the historical record is biased, because the record is the memory of the man who was there. She turned around and she was lit up, not metaphorically, not in the glow of the runes, but in the way she got when a discovery was so complete and so exact that it showed in her face in a way she forgot to manage. Slytherin knew. He knew exactly what he was leaving and exactly what it would be needed for. He was building a case across 1,000 years for the day someone could bring it to court. He was preparing for us, Harry said. She blinked. Technically preparing for anyone the castle chose, but yes, she looked around the room. He couldn't fix what he'd broken in his own lifetime, so he built a mechanism for someone else to fix it later. A pause. He was a remarkable person, she said, with the slightly surprised quality of someone revising a very long-held assessment. Terrible and remarkable. People often are. I know. She was already working out the extraction. He could see it. I can pull the memory out of the runic encoding. It'll take time and it'll need to be done carefully. You can't rush runic extraction without losing information. But it can be done. I can have it ready before the presentation. That gives us the book and a recorded memory, Harry said. Against which Thorn has nothing, Hermione said, and for a moment she sounded exactly like the 11-year-old he'd met on a Hogwarts Express, absolutely certain of an answer, no apology in it. Nothing at all. They were nearly back to the steps when Harry felt it, not a presence, an absence. The ward sense that had been operating continuously for weeks, the awareness of the perimeter in all its dimensions, flickered in the specific way it flickered when something had been very carefully, very skillfully removed. Not broken, removed, like a thread pulled from a tapestry by someone who knew exactly which one to pull to make the pattern unravel quietly. He stopped walking. Hermione. She heard something in his voice and stopped immediately. What? Something just changed in the outer wards, east and north simultaneously. He was reading it through the castle's awareness, trying to find the shape of what was missing. It's coordinated, two simultaneous points. Distraction, she said at once. Or entry. How many? He expanded the ward sense as far as it would reach, which was getting farther every week as the castle and his connection to it grew more fluent. He felt the perimeter like a skin, and the skin had two small numb patches that meant 8, maybe 10. They're moving along the tree line west side, which isn't where the ward changes are. So the east and north breach is a distraction and the main approach is west. She started moving up the steps fast. How long have we got? Minutes. Right. He was already composing the alert as she climbed, a ward pulse that Harry felt ripple outward through the castle, the Hogwarts equivalent of an alarm aimed specifically at McGonagall's office and the faculty quarters. McGonagall will have the castle secured in 3 minutes. 3 minutes is enough for 10 people with a specific target. Yes, she was through the chamber floor and into the main chamber and moving toward the pipe exit without breaking stride. So we don't wait for 3 minutes. They came out into the grounds on the west side of the castle, through one of the hidden exits in the foundation wall that the castle had shown Harry 2 weeks ago, and the attack was already visible across the dark lawn. Not subtle, Isolde Carrow had apparently decided that subtlety had its limits and moved past them. 10 figures in dark robes, spread in a formation that covered the western approach, and at the center of them, a woman who moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent years doing this and had no interest in wasted motion. Isolde Carrow was 40, dark-haired, with the Carrow family's striking bone structure and none of the brutish quality that had made Amicus and Alecto so immediately readable. She was more like a surgical instrument than a bludgeon, precise and cold, and very clearly in charge. She had her wand out, and she was directing people without speaking, hand signals, and Harry thought she probably would have been formidable on any side she'd chosen, and she had chosen this one for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, but intended to. 2 of her people saw Harry and Hermione come out of the foundation exit and the formation adjusted immediately, which told him they'd been briefed on the Founder's Bond on what Harry and Hermione were, which meant Carrow's intelligence was better than he'd wanted it to be. Carrow, Harry said, across 30 feet of dark lawn. She looked at him, no surprise. Potter. Her eyes moved to Hermione. Granger. A slight pause. You're faster than expected. You set off every ward in the castle when you pulled the east threads, Hermione said. Did Thorn not mention that we rewired the entire perimeter structure 2 weeks ago? Something moved in Carrow's expression, a fractional recalculation. Thorn's information is apparently somewhat outdated. His information is always somewhat outdated, Hermione said. He's working from a theoretical framework that hasn't been current for 1,000 years. Notice the east breach. We located the actual approach from the west, and we're here. Whatever you came for isn't going to happen tonight. Carrow looked at her steadily. I came for what's in the chamber. I know. Then you know why I need it. I know what you think you need. Hermione's voice was not unkind, which surprised Harry slightly. It was the voice she used when she was engaging with a position seriously even as she opposed it. You think destroying the founder's record unmakes the legal case? That without the original document and the encoded memory, Thorne's argument about traditional governance carries by default. You think you're protecting something. Kara's stillness had acquired a new quality. He's building a structure that will last centuries. Whatever your intentions, whatever the castle chose you for, the instability you're introducing into wizarding society is going to be exploited by people more dangerous than Thorne. He's one of them, Harry said. He's a moderate compared to what comes after him if his control slips. And this was real. Harry could hear the genuine conviction in it, the thing that made Caro more dangerous than a simple mercenary. She believed this. She had logic she'd arrived at through a specific sequence of experiences and fears, and he did not doubt the experiences or the fears. He just disagreed completely with the conclusion. The balance, there is no balance in a structure built on excluding people, Hermione said, and her voice had gone from engaged to absolute, the shift from argument to statement, no more room for counter. There never was. What you're calling balance is stasis, and what you're calling stability is the comfort of people who benefit from the existing arrangement. I understand the fear that change causes. I understand it very well. But I'm not going to protect 1,000 years of harm because changing it is difficult. The lawn was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Caro raised her wand and said simply, "Take them." What happened next was fast and not clean, and Harry would not have wanted it to be, because clean fights in stories were not real fights, and he had stopped pretending they were a long time ago. 3 of Caro's people came at him simultaneously, which was reasonably intelligent. Alone against Harry Potter, they'd have been folded in seconds, so they worked in overlapping triangles, one forcing his attention high while 2 worked low, a pattern he'd been taught to defeat in aura training and had improved on in the year since. He moved out of the first stunner before it landed and sent 2 back-to-back binding spells at the low pair while he was still moving, clipped one, missed the other, turned the miss into a roll that brought him inside the 3rd attacker's range, and that conversation ended quickly. He was aware of Hermione behind him the way you're aware of weather, as a presence that shaped the whole environment without requiring direct attention. She'd taken the other 7. Not alone, the castle had engaged. This was the part that was genuinely new, the part that was Founder's magic operating at a level that neither of them had tested before. The castle's defenses, the deep wards, the living enchantments that Hermione had been carefully rebuilding and Harry had been carefully reinforcing, responded to the attack on their founders the way a body responds to a threat. Stones moved. Suits of armor that had been reassembled in the corridors came through the ground floor doors with a purposeful clanking. The ground itself shifted under 3 of Caro's people, roots and soil pulling at their feet, the Hogwarts grounds expressing an opinion. And Hermione. He hadn't seen her fight in a full engagement since the Ministry break-in years ago, and that had been desperate and defensive. This was neither. She moved through the 6 people between her and Caro with a fluency that was half combat and half architecture, which made sense when you understood that her connection to the castle was structural. She could feel exactly where people were through the ground, could direct the castle's defensive magic with the same precision she used to analyze wards, 2 stinging hexes that moved as though they turned corners, a shielding charm that expanded outward rather than up and swept 3 people off their feet. A chain of binding spells so fast they were nearly a single motion. She got to Caro in 40 seconds. Caro was good, very good. The duel that opened between them was not the kind Harry could have watched dispassionately even if he hadn't had his own people to deal with. It was sharp and intelligent, and Caro fought with the economy of someone who did not believe in unnecessary movement, which meant everything she did counted. She read Hermione's patterns fast and adjusted faster, and for about 30 seconds Harry thought he needed to get there because this was, Hermione adjusted faster than Caro adjusted. That was the thing. That was simply the thing. Hermione's combat magic had always been brilliant, but it had been slightly reactive historically, finding the response after the threat. Now it was ahead. She was working 3 moves forward with the same mind that constructed theoretical frameworks and extracted runic memories, and wrote 11 pages of foundational theory at 2 in the morning, and Caro was reading what was happening while Hermione was already past it. The binding spell that ended it was casual. The most dangerous-looking ones were in Hermione's repertoire, like she'd been waiting for exactly that configuration of stance and wand angle and was mildly satisfied to see it arrive. Caro went down hard, fully bound, and Hermione stood over her in the dark lawn with her hair a disaster from the engagement and a scorch mark on her left sleeve from a hex that had gotten close, and she looked entirely calm. Harry came to stand beside her, having dealt with the last of his 3 people. The castle's suits of armor stood at various points around the lawn in poses of achievement. 3 of Caro's people were unconscious, the rest were bound. "Are you hurt?" he said. "The sleeve." "I'm fine." She looked down at Caro. "Are you?" "Fine." He looked at his hands. The faint gold luminescence was visible in the skin, brighter than usual, the castle's recognition heightened by the fight. His magic felt expanded, the way it had since the activation, but more so, like something that had been operating at partial capacity finally running at full. He looked up and the castle was there above them in the dark. And the wards were intact except for the pulled threads in the east and north which he could feel and which he was already beginning to push back into place. She genuinely believes what she said, Hermione said quietly, still looking at Caro. About the instability. I know. Harry crouched beside Caro, who was conscious and watching him with the eyes of a woman who had lost a battle but had not revised her position. Caro. Who told you about the chamber, about the original contents? Caro's jaw tightened, said nothing. It wasn't Thorn, Hermione said from above them. He doesn't have that information. He has the hereditary entitlement framework but not the specific knowledge of the original room. She paused. It was Selwyn, one of the Selwyns, past or present, who'd known for generations what was in there. Caro's expression didn't confirm it, but the absence of denial in a face that controlled everything else was answer enough. The Selwyn family has been trying to retrieve something from the chamber for generations, Harry said, standing up. And they apparently told you about it, which means they have a relationship with you that isn't about Thorn's governance structure, which means there are multiple separate interests converging on the same point. That makes things more complicated, Hermione said. Yes. Harry looked at Caro one more time. We're going to have a conversation, not tonight. Tonight you're going to the Aura office and you're going to be in a cell next to the two people we sent last night. But at some point before Thorn's Wisengamot hearing, I want to understand what you actually believe you're protecting. Caro looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. You're not afraid of me, she said. No, most people are. I've met Voldemort, Harry said. Comparatively, the scale runs differently. Something moved in Caro's face, not offense, something more like unwilling respect, and beneath that something that was possibly the first crack in the armor of her conviction. You have no idea, she said quietly, what you've set in motion, not because you're wrong, because being right is sometimes just as destabilizing as being wrong. Harry held her gaze. I know exactly what we've set in motion, he said. We set it in motion deliberately, that's the point. McGonagall arrived with 2 faculty members, and the suits of armor arranged themselves respectfully as she surveyed the lawn and then the 10 bound or unconscious people on it with the expression of someone who has seen worse but had hoped for a peaceful Wednesday evening. Everyone alive, she said. Everyone alive, Harry confirmed. The auras are on their way. She looked at Caro, then at Harry and Hermione. Are you both fine? They said together, and then looked at each other, and Hermione's mouth did the thing it did when she was suppressing something. McGonagall looked between them with an expression that was remarkably similar to the one Ginny had worn in the Founder's chamber on the first day, acknowledging something without naming it, which was, Harry was beginning to think, a habit of everyone around them that he and Hermione were apparently the last to fully understand. The auras were there and gone in an hour. By the time the lawn was clear, and the castle's suits of armor had been walked back inside and the wards were fully repaired, Harry had sealed the east and north threads while Hermione reinforced the west perimeter, working in the easy coordination that had become their default, neither of them needing to direct the other. It was past midnight and the cold was the proper kind, the autumn kind that got into your bones and told you it was staying. They sat on the front steps because somehow neither of them had gone inside yet. Harry's jacket, Hermione's robes, a comfortable silence that was doing double duty as processing time. Caro's not wrong about the instability, Hermione said. No, change on this scale produces instability. The question is whether the instability of changing a broken system is worse than the stability of keeping it. It isn't, Harry said. I know. She paused, and something moved through her face that wasn't doubt but was honest reckoning. I want to be sure we're thinking about the whole system, not just the parts we're good at thinking about. This was one of the things Harry had known about her for years but which struck him differently now, the way she held both her certainty and her scrutiny simultaneously, never letting conviction become complacency. It was, he thought, the thing that made her most worth listening to. We are, he said. Because you won't let us not. She was quiet for a moment and then said in a different voice, lower, less constructed, I keep thinking about Slytherin building that room alone, writing the agreement down and sealing it away where no one could reach it, living with what he'd broken and knowing he couldn't fix it in his lifetime. She looked at the dark grounds. That's a very specific kind of loneliness. Harry thought about it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, it is. I wonder if he trusted anyone, she said. At the end, when everything had gone the way it went. Maybe the room, Harry said. The book, something. She turned and looked at him, and he looked back, and the something that had been building in the air between them for weeks was there again, immediate and warm and entirely present, and neither of them moved into it or away from it, because they were both, in their separate ways, still finding the words for it. You fought well tonight, she said, which was not what she'd been going to say. He could tell because it was too organized, too landed, compared to whatever had been in her face 3 seconds ago. You were better, he said, which was what he actually meant. The castle helped. The castle always helps. That was still you. She looked at her hands, the scorch mark on the sleeve, the slight tremor in the left one that was the after-effect of significant magical output and that she was not pretending wasn't there. He reached over without thinking and covered her hands with one of his, briefly the way you cover a candle flame from the wind. It was nothing. It was a moment. He let go. She didn't say anything, neither did he. Both of them were looking at the grounds, but the silence after was different, warmer somehow. Like a room that someone has just walked into. The presentation is in 8 days, she said. Yes, and whatever else is in the chamber, we need to go back. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. She stood, smoothing her robes, retrieving the person she presented to the world from wherever she went in quiet moments like this. Get some sleep, Harry, you too. She went inside. He stayed on the steps for a few more minutes, looking at the grounds and the repaired wards and the dark tree lane where Caro's people had emerged from, and he was tired in the good way, the way where you know you've done the thing you were there to do and the night can end honestly. The castle was quiet around him, not the quiet of emptiness, the settled quiet of a thing that is whole and held and watched over. He put his hand flat against the stone step, and the faint warmth that lived in the castle's bones moved up through his palm, and he thought, 8 days, Thorn's hearing, whatever else is in that room. Caro in a cell and Selwyn in a cell, and both of them knowing something that wasn't fully assembled yet. He thought, we're ready. He went inside, and the castle doors closed behind him with a sound like a held breath released. Chapter 5, The Ritual and the Rift. The conversation with Fenwick Selwyn happened on a Thursday, 5 days before the presentation, in a small room at the ministry that smelled like old parchment and institutional anxiety. Kingsley had arranged it. Technically it was an aura interview. Technically Selwyn was still in custody pending review of the charges against him, and technically Harry and Hermione had no official standing to be in the room. Kingsley had looked at them both when they'd asked and then arranged it anyway, which was the kind of minister he was. Selwyn looked better than Harry had expected for a man who'd spent 3 days in a ministry holding cell. Not comfortable, the Selwyn family bearing would not permit comfortable in a holding cell, but composed. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he looked at Harry and Hermione when they came in with the expression of someone who had spent 3 days deciding exactly what to say. Before you start, he said, I want to be clear that I know how this looks. Like you were breaking into Hogwarts with 2 wanted Death Eater associates, Harry said, sitting across from him. That's how it looks because that's what was happening. Byrne and Pelton were hired, Selwyn said. I needed people who could handle the ward breach on the east side. They were available and motivated by money, and I was not in a position to be selective about character references. Where did you find Death Eater mercenaries at short notice? Hermione asked, taking the chair beside Harry and opening her notebook. The same place you find most things in Wizarding Britain if you have the right family name, Selwyn said, with a dryness that Harry thought was probably genetic. Through someone who knows someone who owes someone a favor. A pause. My father doesn't know I was there that night. Your father thinks you were home, Hermione said. My father thinks I share his priorities. He has been wrong about this for approximately 20 years, but he is a persistent man. Harry leaned back in his chair, reading Selwyn with the instinct he'd developed over years of encountering people who were complicated in ways that required patient attention. The man was not performing contrition. He wasn't performing anything particularly. He was just talking, which was, Harry thought, either extremely honest or extremely sophisticated and worth finding out which. Tell us about the room, Harry said. The original chamber, what does your family know about it? Selwyn was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, preparing, which was different. My family has a history with Slytherin that goes back to the founding, he said. Not direct descent, that line died out, but a different kind of connection, a responsibility. He paused. Slytherin told a member of my family what was in the room, not the book. We didn't know about the book until recently. The other thing, the memory. He told someone about the encoded memory, Hermione said, before he left Hogwarts. He was going, the break with the other founders was final, and he told a Selwyn ancestor what he'd hidden and why and asked them to not retrieve it, to watch over it, to ensure it was preserved until the time was right. Selwyn looked at his folded hands. The family has been watching for 1,000 years, failing to retrieve it several times, being wrong about who the right person was. A slight pause, being very wrong some generations. The pure blood history, Harry said. Yes. And this came out with the particular quality of someone acknowledging a family failing, not self-flagellating, not minimizing, just a person with clear eyes about where they came from. Several generations of my family decided the memory needed to be retrieved for reasons that were inconsistent with its original purpose. My grandfather tried in 1942. For reasons I find, he stopped. There was a boy at Hogwarts that year who had already found the chamber. My grandfather was trying to get to the original room before him. Harry thought about Tom Riddle at 16 and what he'd done in the chamber in 1943. He didn't make it. No, and then the basilisk made subsequent access difficult. Selwyn looked up. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that my being there that night was not what my family would have sanctioned. My father wants Thorn's governance structure. He thinks that's how you protect what's left of traditional wizarding society. I think, he stopped again, with the expression of someone choosing exactness over speed. I think the memory in that room is evidence that the traditional wizarding society my father wants to protect never actually existed the way he believes it did. And I think the right people to retrieve it are the ones the castle chose. The room was quiet. You broke into the school to give us access to something you think we should have, Hermione said slowly. I broke into the school because I didn't know how else to get your attention without going through channels my father monitors. A pause. The hiring of Byrne and Pelton was poor judgment. I was in a hurry and Caro was already moving and he exhaled. I made a mess of it. You did, Harry agreed. Why didn't you just ask? Selwyn looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost funny. I'm a Selwyn who'd just been at the gate with my father trying to file a governance claim. I didn't think a knock on the door would be received warmly. Harry glanced at Hermione. She was reading Selwyn with the same focused attention she'd been applying throughout, and what he saw in her face was not the closed expression that meant she'd found inconsistency but something more open, the careful recalibration of an accurate assessment. We already have the memory, she said, and the book. We found them 2 days after the activation. She watched Selwyn absorb this. What we don't have is context. The history of the room from the other side, your family's record of what Slytherin told you, what was preserved orally, what your grandfather knew. She paused. That's what you can give us, isn't it? Selwyn was very still for a moment, then something in him came down some prepared position he'd been holding, and he said, yes, that's what I can give you. And this time his voice had a quality it hadn't had before, something lighter underneath the composure. Relief, Harry thought. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying a responsibility alone for a long time, and has just been told they don't have to. They came out of the ministry into the grey October afternoon with 2 hours of Selwyn's family history in Hermione's notebook, and a tentative agreement that he would provide a formal written account before the presentation. I believe him, Harry said on the ministry steps. So do I, Hermione said, which complicates the family picture considerably. The father is still working with Thorn, and the son is working against them both without telling either of them. She tucked her notebook inside her robes. Wizarding family dynamics are extraordinary, says someone who spent a formative period living in a tent with 2 other people and nearly destroyed all 3 relationships. She looked at him. That's not the same thing. No, but it's not entirely different either. He started down the ministry steps. The memory extraction, how long? I finished it last night. She fell into step beside him. It's in a pensive vial. I've reviewed it 3 times. Harry, she stopped walking, which made him stop. They were on the pavement outside the ministry, October traffic moving around them, wizards in robes, muggles in coats, the intersection of 2 worlds that didn't know about each other. The memory is extraordinary, seeing them, all 4 of them in the original agreement. Slytherin is, she paused. He's exactly who you saw in the castle's memory. He argues against everyone else's phrasing in the document, makes them change 3 paragraphs, looks like he's going to walk out twice, and then signs it and sits back and looks. She shook her head slightly. Like someone who has just done the most important thing they've ever done and knows it. Harry looked at her. The October light was doing something to the color in her face, bringing out the warmth in her skin and the brightness in her eyes, and she was telling him about a 1,000-year-old memory with the focused intensity she brought to everything that genuinely moved her. And he thought, as he was increasingly thinking, that this was a person he could not imagine doing any of this without, not as dependency, not as insufficiency. Just as a fact of what this had become, the same way the castle's presence had become a fact, natural, inarguable, something that had always been moving toward being exactly this. Good, he said, we'll use it in the presentation. We'll use it, she agreed, and they kept walking. The message from Kingsley arrived the next morning at 6:15, and it landed like a stone through glass. Harry read it twice, standing in the corridor outside his room with his coffee going cold in his other hand, and then went directly to Hermione's study without knocking. She was awake and working, of course she was, and she looked at his face when he came in and put her quill down immediately. He handed her the letter. She read it. Her expression, which was usually in motion when she was reading, tracking, assessing, responding, went completely still. She read it again. The ritual of unmaking, she said. Yes, Kingsley's intelligence says Caro gave Thorn something from custody. Information, Harry said. She gave him information. She's made a deal. Hermione set the letter down on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a precise quantity of fury. She traded information about the founder's bond for reduced charges, apparently. And Thorn now has the theoretical framework for... She stopped, picked up the letter again, read the relevant section. Her jaw was tight. The ritual of unmaking, I've heard of it. In theory only, it's in the restricted section. It's been in the restricted section for 300 years, and for good reason. She stood up. It targets the founder's bond specifically, the living anchor. Kingsley said the ritual requires an anchor, Harry said, watching her. That a founder's bond creates he called it a reciprocal magical investment, something the 2 bonded individuals place in each other without knowing they've done it. She was moving around her desk, pulling books, and her hands were completely steady, which was the worse things were, the stiller Hermione's hands got. Because it's not a deliberate choice, it happens as a function of the bond deepening over time. The deeper the connection, the more substantial the anchor. She found the book she wanted, opened it, scanned a page, and her expression confirmed what Harry had suspected since he'd read Kingsley's letter. It's essentially the castle works through us because we're connected to each other and to it. The bond isn't just castle to person, it's also, she stopped. Person to person, Harry said. She looked at him, and for the first time in weeks the managed quality of her expression was entirely absent. She was just looking at him without the structure she usually kept in place, and what he saw in her face was complicated and clear and had obviously been there for longer than either of them had directly acknowledged. The ritual targets that, she said, and her voice was very even. The anchor the two founders hold in each other. If it's performed successfully, it severs the personal bond, and the severing doesn't just end the connection. It unmakes the magic that was built through it. Everything we've done to the castle, every ward I've built, every protection you've reinforced, it would collapse. She paused, and it would. Another pause, shorter, controlled. The description says the physical and magical cost to the individuals involved is significant. How significant? Significant. She held his gaze. The room was quiet. Harry sat down on the edge of her desk, which he did sometimes when they were working through something difficult. The informality of it helped somehow, the lack of table between them. For the ritual to work, he said, what does Thorn need? The ritual requires 3 things. She was back in the book, her voice taking on the quality it took when she was using precision as anchor, using information as something to hold on to. First, a genuine anchor must exist, a reciprocal magical investment of significant depth. Second, the ritual must be performed on a point of magical convergence, ideally one connected to the bond itself. Third, it has to be initiated during a period of active magical demonstration when the bonded pair are using their founder power, because that's when the anchor is most accessible. She looked up. The presentation, Harry confirmed. They looked at each other. He's planning to perform the ritual during the presentation, Hermione said, when we're both actively engaged in demonstrating the founder's magic in front of the Wisengamot and the press. When the bond is most visible, Harry said. Yes, she set the book down. He's not going to interrupt it or stop it. He's going to let us make our case and then destroy the foundation it stands on, from inside the Great Hall, in front of everyone, while we're standing there. Harry was quiet for a moment. Right, he said, so we know about it. And knowing changes everything. She confirmed. We can prepare, we can adapt the presentation structure so the anchor isn't accessible in the way the ritual requires. We can ward the Great Hall specifically against the ritual's entry points. She was already writing. We can use the knowledge that he's planning this as evidence during the presentation itself, demonstrate that the opposition to the founder's bond is not academic or legal but active and destructive. We can, Hermione. She stopped writing. We should talk about the other part, he said. She looked at her desk. Her hands, which had been still, moved briefly, adjusted the angle of her notebook, capped her ink pot, the small unconscious reorganizations of someone who is buying time. Anchor, she said. Yes, the reciprocal magical investment, she said it carefully, of significant depth. Yes, which we apparently have. She looked up and her eyes were very direct, the way they got when she was committing to honesty about something difficult, developed without our knowledge as a function of the bond deepening over time, which means it was there before either of us noticed, Harry said. Yes, and when Kingsley's letter says significant depth, it means the anchor is substantial. Which means the connection is, she stopped, found the word. Significant. Harry looked at her steadily and she looked back at him, and the room had the quality it had been developing for weeks, that warmth, that particular gravity, two things drawn toward each other by something older than decision. How long have you known? He asked, not accusatorially, just a question, because he was genuinely curious, because Hermione's awareness of herself and others was generally ahead of his own. She was quiet for 3 seconds. She stopped, started differently, that something was changing a while since the activation in the clearer form, but before that in a less organized form. She looked at the window. I told myself it was the intensity of the situation, shared purpose, high stakes, proximity. A slight pause. I tell myself a lot of things. So do I, Harry said. She looked at him. Something in her expression asked a question she didn't put into words. The ash chair, he said. The first time I sat in it, when I looked at you and felt not just the magic. The feeling wasn't about the magic. He paused. I was very careful about it afterward, for a while. Why careful? Because we were doing something important and I didn't want to, he searched for the right phrase, introduce a variable I couldn't manage. She almost laughed at that, not mockingly, the genuine laugh that came up when something was both very him and very absurd. A variable you couldn't manage. It seemed like the right framework at the time. Harry, the castle built an anchor of significant depth into the magic we've been doing together for a month. The variable was already completely unmanageable. I'm aware of that now. Good. She was looking at him with the expression that was direct and clear and had all the structures down, and he thought that this was one of the things he found most extraordinary about her, that when she decided to be honest, she was completely honest, no hedging, no performance. She just said the thing. I don't want to lose what we're building here, she said. The castle, the work, she paused. What we are to each other already. I don't want to be careless with any of it. Neither do I, he said. She paused again, and for a moment she looked like someone standing at the edge of something and deciding it isn't actually the edge but more of a step. We acknowledge it, that there's something here, that it's real, that it's been real for long enough to build an anchor of significant depth. A pause, and then we figure out what to do with it. In that order, he said. In that order, she exhaled slowly. Something is here. Yes, Harry said, it is. The room was quiet, and it was the best kind of quiet, the kind that was full rather than empty, and neither of them moved and neither of them needed to, because this was enough for right now, this acknowledgement, this honest standing in the fact of it without rushing to resolve it into something it wasn't ready to be. After a moment, Harry said, the ritual. The ritual, she confirmed and picked up her quill. And the acknowledgement stayed in the room around them while they worked, warm and solid, like the chairs in the founder's chamber, like the castle's bones. The next 4 days were the most concentrated work either of them had done since the war, which was a comparison that said something. Hermione dismantled and rebuilt the Great Hall's ward structure 3 times, each iteration incorporating what she'd learned about the ritual of unmaking's access points. The ritual required specific resonance points, places where the anchor's magic was most accessible, which corresponded to the places in the hall where the founder's power would be most actively demonstrated. She had to engineer the presentation so that those demonstration points were shielded without the shielding being obvious, which was the kind of problem that required simultaneous precision in 2 different magical frameworks and kept her up until 3 in the morning for 4 consecutive nights. Harry reinforced every external ward and then started working on something new, something he couldn't quite articulate but that the castle was helping him build, a responsive defense structure that didn't just block but redirected, channeled, returned. He thought of it as a mirror made of wards. Hermione looked at his sketches on the 4th night and said, "That's brilliant," actually in the distracted tone of someone revising a framework, and he felt something warm about that. Ron arrived on the 3rd day because Hermione had sent him a letter that apparently conveyed urgency without specifics, which was a talent. He came into the Great Hall where Harry was working on the ward mirror and sat down and said, "All right, what's actually happening?" Harry told him. All of it, the ritual, the anchor, the presentation plan, Thorn's strategy. He left out the conversation in Hermione's study room, not because he was hiding it, but because it wasn't fully formed yet into something with the shape of a story, and Ron was perceptive enough to feel the gap but gracious enough not to press it. "So Thorn is going to try to do this ritual during the presentation," Ron said. "Yes, in the Great Hall, with Hermione's new ward structure. With Hermione's new ward structure." Ron was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone doing tactical math. "He doesn't know you know." "No, so his plan is built on surprise." He turned this over. "You're not going to warn him off." "No, you're going to let him try it." "We're going to let him try it and we're going to be ready," Harry said. "The presentation is the right venue, the Wisengamot, the press, Kingsley, all of them present. If Thorn performs an illegal ritual intended to harm 2 people and destroy the foundational magic of Hogwarts in front of all of them, the legal and political case he spent months building collapses completely." Ron stared at him for a long moment. "You and Hermione planned this together?" "Yes, and you're completely calm about it?" "Yes, right." Ron looked at the hall's ceiling, which had been fully restored 2 days ago to its normal enchanted state. Real sky this morning, a proper October grey, the first clouds of approaching autumn. "I've been thinking," he said, "that the 2 of you are different now in ways I'm still figuring out, and I've been thinking that some of those ways are they're good, really good." He glanced at Harry. "The founder's thing and the other thing." Harry kept his face neutral. "Ron." "I'm not going to make it weird," Ron said. "I'm just noting that I'm observant. People underestimate me on the observant front." He stood up. "What do you need me to do for the presentation?" "We need someone in the audience who knows what's coming," Harry said. "Someone who can watch Thorn and identify the moment he initiates the ritual and give us the signal." Ron nodded with the expression he'd worn going into the ministry and the chamber and a dozen other places he hadn't been required to go. "Done. What's the signal?" "Your worst defensive move," Harry said. "The wrinkle hex thing you always went for under pressure." Ron's expression moved through a front and landed on something like affection. "Fine, the wrinkle hex." The night before the presentation, with everything prepared and the Great Hall glowing with restored magic and the wards sitting in their new configuration, Harry and Hermione did one last thing. They went to the Founder's chamber, not for a specific purpose, not to adjust anything or check anything or work through a problem. Just because it was theirs, this room, and tomorrow everything would be public and loud and contested, and tonight was quiet, and sometimes quiet needed to be used properly. They sat in their chairs and the glyphs came up warm and gold, and the room did the thing it always did when they were both there, the double note of recognition, harmonics that only existed when both of them were present. It had stopped being overwhelming weeks ago and become simply the room's version of hello. "Are you ready?" Harry said. Hermione thought about it honestly, which was always how she answered real questions. "For the presentation, yes. For whatever happens after it, I don't know exactly what after looks like yet." "Me neither, but we've never known what after looked like," she said, "and we always ended up somewhere worth being." He looked at her in the gold light and she looked back at him, and the acknowledgement from 4 days ago was still present between them, solid and warm and not demanding resolution, just existing. "The anchor," he said. "The anchor," she agreed. "Thorn thinks it's a vulnerability." "He's wrong," she said simply. "I know he's wrong." Harry looked at the rune on his chair's arm, shield. "It's the most solid thing in this whole situation. It's the thing everything else is built on." She looked at the rune on hers, foundation. She reached over and placed her hand over his on the arm of the ash chair, not lacing her fingers through his, not anything that was a declaration, just her palm over the back of his hand, warm and certain. "He can try," she said. Harry turned his hand over under hers and held it. The castle hummed. The glyphs burned gold. The 2 dark chairs, Hufflepuff and Slytherin, still waiting, seemed in the warm light to be slightly less dark than they had been. As though the choice the castle was still watching for was closer than it had been, the distance measurable now, the waiting almost done. They sat there for a long while in the quiet room at the heart of the ancient castle, two people who had carried each other through impossible things and who were discovering in the calm after the last fire and before the next, that carrying each other had never been a burden. It had always been this. Aldrich Thorne arrived the following morning in dress robes of charcoal and silver, accompanied by 4 Wisengamot members and the solicitor who'd been present at the Selwyn Gate visit. He was preceded by about 20 minutes by the Selwyn family, Cashan and his older son, and notably separately Fenwick, who had been released into his family's custody pending the formal hearing on his charges, and who came in with the expression of a man navigating 2 separate minefields simultaneously. The press arrived. 3 journalists from the Daily Prophet, 2 from other outlets, a camera operator whose photographs would move in the way magical photographs always did, catching things between moments. Kingsley arrived last, which was the prerogative of ministers, and he came in and surveyed the room with the complete stillness that was his version of taking stock, and his eyes found Harry and Hermione at the front of the hall, and something in them was very calm and very intent. McGonagall opened the proceedings. The great hall was full. Faculty, reconstruction volunteers, former students, political figures, journalists. The restored ceiling showed real October sky, properly cold and blue. The 4 long tables were back, all 4 this time, and the presentation materials, the book, the pensive containing Slytherin's memory, Hermione's formal analysis, were arranged on a table beside the founders' chairs that had been brought for the first time out of the circular room and into the hall. When the chairs arrived in the hall, something changed in the room's atmosphere. The chairs were just wood, just very old, carefully carved wood, but they were also the founders' seats, and the castle knew them and the hall knew them, and the combined awareness of the castle and its occupants produced a quality that was not exactly magic, not exactly history, but was the particular feeling of standing inside something significant. Harry and Hermione stood at the front of the hall, side by side, and looked at the assembled room. Thorne was in the 3rd row, perfectly composed, his hands folded in his lap. He was watching them with the careful attention of a man waiting for a specific moment, and Harry let him watch. Ron was 9 rows back on the left side in the aisle seat, looking exactly like a person attending a presentation and eating a quiet breakfast pastry. Harry noted his position and let it go. Hermione stepped forward. The hall went quiet with the quality of genuine attention rather than polite silence. "We're going to show you something today," she said, and her voice was entirely steady and carried to every corner of the hall without magical amplification because the castle was listening and helped. "We're going to show you what Hogwarts was built to be, not what it became, not what certain interests want it to be, what the people who built it, all 4 of them, agreed it should be." A pause, and then "We're going to invite you to help us build it." She stepped back, Harry stepped forward. "Hogwarts was built for every child with magic," he said. "That's not our opinion, that's the founding agreement in the founder's own hands, sealed in the foundations of this castle for 1,000 years. We're going to show it to you." He looked at Thorne, directly. Thorne met his gaze and his composure did not move. Harry smiled at him, which was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knows the board, and looked away. Hermione opened the pensive. The memory rose from it in the way pensive memories always did, silver blue, luminous, expanding into the space above the table, in the 3-dimensional projection that allowed a room full of people to witness simultaneously. Slytherin and Gryffindor and Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, 1,000 years ago, making an agreement, and Slytherin's face above the table in the hall was unmistakable, and the signature at the bottom of the document was his, and the magic that authenticated the memory was the magic of the castle itself, older than any forgery could reach. The hall was very still. Harry felt at the perimeter of his ward sense the moment Thorne began the ritual. Ron's hand lifted at the same instant. The wrinkle hex delivered smoothly and received smoothly, Harry tracking the entry points, the resonant structure Thorne had built into his position in the hall over the past hour without anyone noticing. It was elegant. Harry gave him that. The ritual's access points were exactly where a non-warded presentation would have been most vulnerable, the places Hermione had identified and then specifically shielded in her 3 iterations of the ward structure. The ritual entered at those points and met Hermione's shields and moved exactly as she'd predicted it would move, laterally, seeking the anchor from a different angle, finding the redirect Harry had built, the ward mirror. And then it came back. Not harmfully, Harry had designed it to return rather than rebound. A gentle reversal, the magical equivalent of a door that won't open rather than a door that hits you in the face. The ritual simply returned to its source, and the resonance Thorne had built collapsed quietly, and what he felt from across the room was a very controlled internal adjustment as a man revised his assessment of the situation. Thorne stood up. "I'd like to address the evidence," he said, and his voice was composed and legal and entirely assured. He was a man who had prepared for the possibility of this going wrong and had a secondary approach. "The document's provenance is established by the castle's own authentication," Hermione said without looking up from the projection controls, "which requires the castle's recognition of founders' standing. I can walk you through the runic authentication if you'd like. It will take some time. The memory's integrity, is verified by 3 independent runic analysts who reviewed the encoding in situ, she said. Their reports are in the documentation package provided to every Wisengamot member present. She finally looked up. Mr. Thorne, you just attempted to perform the ritual of unmaking in a room full of witnesses. The hall went very still in a different way. Thorne's composure held. That's a serious allegation. It's a recorded fact, Harry said. The ward structure of this hall has been logging every magical action taken within it since we rebuilt it. The log is available to Minister Shacklebolt. He looked at Kingsley. Kingsley was already standing. His expression was the one that meant this had been expected and prepared for, and his voice when he spoke had the calm authority of a man who was comfortable with the weight of his office. The Aura office will receive a full report by this afternoon. Mr. Thorne, I'd ask you not to leave the building. Thorne looked at Harry across the hall. The composed expression had not broken, it wouldn't, Harry thought. He was too contained for that, but beneath it something had shifted. Not defeat, not yet, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had made an argument in a room that had just conclusively answered it and was now reckoning with the fact that he had been wrong not just strategically but in some deeper sense. You planned this, Thorne said. Yes, Harry said. You knew about the ritual. Yes. You let me attempt it. A pause to make the case. Yes, Hermione said. Thorne looked at her and then back at Harry, and his expression did something Harry hadn't expected. It became very briefly almost honest. The mask of the patient, reasonable man slipping just enough to show the person underneath who had genuinely believed he was protecting something. You're going to change everything, he said. Yes, Harry said. That's correct. It will be difficult. Yes. There will be consequences you haven't anticipated. Probably. Harry held his gaze. There were consequences to the old arrangement too. We just didn't always see them because they happened to people who didn't have the right to complain loudly. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at the pensive memory still glowing above the table, Slytherin's face above them all, the founding agreement visible in silver blue, and something left him. Not completely, not finally, but the specific rigidity of a position defended past the point of evidence gave way to something that might, in time, become something else. He sat down. He did not leave the building. Afterward, when the hall had emptied of journalists and Wisengamot members and Kingsley's careful official activity, Harry and Hermione sat on the edge of the presentation table in the quiet hall with the restored ceiling above them showing the first stars of early evening, and Hermione said, "He'll be charged. It might not stick, the ritual was blocked and no harm was done, and his lawyers are going to argue technical definitions for months. But it's on record," Harry said. "It's on record." Turned the pensive vial in her fingers. "The governance proposal dies." Kingsley said 3 of the 4 Wisengamot members he brought today are already indicating they won't support it. And Thorne, she was quiet for a moment. "I don't think he's done, but I think he's different now. Something changed when he saw the memory." A pause. "He spent decades building a framework on a historical foundation that doesn't exist. That's a particular kind of reckoning." Harry thought about this. Caro. She made a deal that backfired on her. The information she gave Thorne about the ritual was used in a way she hadn't intended, and the charges against her aren't going away. Hermione looked at the ceiling. "I want to understand her properly at some point. Her argument about instability, it wasn't completely wrong." "No," Harry agreed, "just wrong enough." They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in it, in the hall's restored warmth and the evening stars above, and the sense of something having been accomplished that was not complete but was real. Fenwick Selwyn looked relieved, Harry said. "He finally did what his family was supposed to do," Hermione said. "Helped it get to the right people. Took 1,000 years and a breaking and entering charge, but it happened." A slight pause, and her voice did the thing it did when something had genuinely moved her and she was letting it. "I keep thinking about Slytherin building that room, writing everything down, encoding the memory, asking a family he trusted to watch over it." She looked at Harry. "He did everything he could from inside the mess he'd made, he just couldn't be there to see it work." "He got close," Harry said. "The portrait, the castle, in the memory today, he was in the room, sort of." She looked at him and her smile was small and real and reached all the way up. Sort of. The hall was quiet around them. The castle hummed in its satisfied way, the way it had been humming since the activation, that deep contentment of a living thing that is being properly cared for. The 4 tables, the open ceiling, the wards newly layered and tested and holding. Harry looked at Hermione in the evening light and she looked back at him, and the anchor between them, the thing Thorne had tried to destroy and failed, the thing the castle had been building alongside them without either of them seeing it until they had to, was as present as the stones beneath them. "The 2 dark chairs," Harry said. "I've been thinking about that. Hufflepuff and Slytherin still waiting." She turned the pensive vial one more time and then set it on the table. "I have a theory." "Of course you do. It's not ready yet. Tell me when it is," he said. "You'll be the first," she said. He reached over and found her hand where it rested on the table, and held it the way he had in the Founder's chamber, warm and certain, and she let him, and the evening deepened around them into real night, and the castle's stars came out above them in the restored ceiling, the enchanted sky cycling through its slow familiar beauty, and Hogwarts held them both the way it had always held the things it loved. Safe, known, home. Chapter 6, the founding 3 days after the presentation, Isolde Caro asked to speak with Harry and Hermione. Not through a lawyer, not through Kingsley's formal channels. A letter hand-delivered to the Ministry Holding Facilities visitor desk by a young Aura who looked slightly confused about the chain of custody. The letter was short, the handwriting precise and unsentimental, and it said, "I have information you need, not about Thorn, about what's still in the ground beneath your castle. Come before the week is out." Harry read it at breakfast. Hermione read it over his shoulder, which she'd been doing for years without either of them registering it as a thing. "She's not wrong that there's still something down there," Harry said. "Selwyn's account mentioned a third element," Hermione said, reaching past him for the salt without looking. "Something he called the living record, separate from the book, separate from the encoded memory. His family's oral history was vague on what it actually was." "You're going to tell me we need to talk to Caro? We need to talk to Caro." "I was going to say that anyway," he said. She gave him a look that said she knew that. The Ministry Holding Facility was not a pleasant building, but it was well run. Kingsley had instituted reforms in the immediate post-war period that had made meaningful differences to its daily operation, and the room where they met Caro had windows and a table and chairs, and the general quality of a space where a genuine conversation was possible rather than impossible. Caro was sitting when they arrived, wearing the plain grey of ministry custody, and she looked tired in the way that wasn't physical but something deeper, the tiredness of someone who has been running a specific race and has recently reconsidered the finish line. She looked at them for a moment. "The ritual failed." "Yes," Harry said, sitting across from her. Hermione sat beside him. Completely. Caro was quiet. Something moved through her expression, not regret exactly, more like the specific adjustment of a person who has operated on a theory for a long time and has encountered sufficient counter-evidence to require a genuine revision. "Thorn didn't tell me about the ward modifications. He presented the ritual as a certainty." "He believed it was," Hermione said. "He had good theoretical knowledge. The execution was another matter. He underestimated you." "Several people have," Harry said without heat. Caro looked at him for a moment. "I was not one of them," she said. "My being there was never about underestimating you. It was about the stakes being large enough to risk it anyway." She paused. "I still believe that what you're doing will destabilize things in ways you're not fully accounting for, but I also—" She stopped in the way of someone finding precision. "I watched the memory in the pensive projection from my cell. They brought it through the ministry on documentation transfer, and someone set it running in the corridor outside, and I watched it through the observation window." Harry waited. "Slytherin," she said. "I've spent 20 years citing Slytherin's founding principles as the basis for maintaining certain traditional structures." A very slight pause. "The man in that memory signed a document that says the opposite of everything I've been citing him for." "Yes," Hermione said gently. "Someone has been wrong for a very long time about what those principles were." "Yes, and that someone's arguments have been used to harm people." "Yes," Harry said. Caro looked at her hands on the table. The stillness in her was different from the controlled stillness of the woman on the lawn at Hogwarts that had been readiness, the compaction of a person about to act. This was the stillness of someone sitting with something genuinely difficult. "I'm not going to tell you I've reversed all my positions in the 3 days since the presentation," she said. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence with a conversion story. What I can tell you is that the ground shifted and I am a pause. Reconsidering." "That's honest," Harry said. "We'll take it." She looked at him with the unwilling respect that had been present on the lawn, but more of it this time. "The third element in the chamber," she said, "the living record. My information about it came from Fenwick Selwyn, who is pulling from his family's oral history, which is fragmentary and partially corrupted by generations of people interpreting it through their own agendas." She folded her hands. "What I know is that it's not passive, not like the book or the memory. It's active, it responds, and it was specifically built to activate when the castle had found its new founders." Harry looked at Hermione. She was already working through the implications. He could see it. "It's been waiting for us," he said, not a question. "According to the Selwyn record, yes." Caro paused. "And according to that record there is a window, a period after the castle's recognition during which the living record is accessible. After that period," she paused again. "The record was designed with a failsafe. If no one retrieves it within the window, it destroys itself." "How long is the window?" Hermione said. 40 days from the activation." Harry counted backward. The activation had been in early October. Today was 4 days, Hermione said, and she was already standing. The descent into the original chamber had a different quality this time, not the exploratory, careful quality of the first visit, not the urgent assessment quality of the second. Something more inevitable, the quality of a final stage that has been building toward itself. The blue light was different, brighter. When they came through the restored passage and into the circular room, the plinth was no longer just the plinth with the book. The book had moved itself to the wall, propped open, and the plinth held something else now, something that had not been there before. It was small. A sphere roughly the size of a large apple, made of something between glass and crystal and neither, and it held inside it a light that was not the steady blue of the runic encoding but something more complex, shifting, breathing, warm and cool in alternation, the internal landscape of something genuinely alive. "Oh," Hermione said softly. She didn't move toward it. She just looked at it with complete attention. "Oh, that's Harry, that's living magic." Not magical in the way everything in this room is magical. Living, it has its own. She was reaching for the right word, her hands hovering at her sides. It has its own consciousness. Harry was looking at it too, and through the castle's awareness he felt what she meant. The sphere was not an object in the way that other objects were objects. It had presence, intention. It was aware of them in the room, and was responding to that awareness the way a sleeping creature responds to being approached, not waking exactly but shifting, orienting. He stepped toward it. The sphere rose from the plinth. Not violently, not even dramatically. It simply lifted into the air between him and Hermione at chest height and rotated slowly, and the light inside it changed, the blues and the golds braiding together into something that was the color of the Founder's chamber when both their chairs were lit. The castle's recognition distilled into a sphere. "It's a seed," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "That's what it feels like," he said. "Through the castle connection, like it's the original intent, compressed. Everything they agreed on at the founding, everything in the book and the memory, but not as a record, as a live thing, something that can be planted." Hermione was very still. Where Harry looked at the sphere rotated. The castle hummed through the soles of his feet, up through his bones, the deep familiar warmth of a 1,000-year-old building that had been waiting for exactly this. "The center," he said, "the exact center of the castle. That's the foundations," she said, "the oldest stones." "Below the dungeons?" "Yes." She looked at the sphere for a long moment. "If we plant it, if it grows into the foundation, it changes the castle's magic fundamentally at the deepest level." She was thinking aloud, which she let herself do with him in ways she didn't with most people. Not the wards, not the external enchantments, the essential character of the place, what it is. "It becomes what it was meant to be," Harry said, "from the beginning. Which is what we've been trying to build toward anyway." A pause. "We should think carefully about this, we can't undo it." "I've thought about it, Harry, I've had roughly 45 seconds. I've been feeling toward it for weeks," he said. "Through the castle, it's been moving this direction the whole time. The activation, the ward work, the presentation, it's been building toward this moment." He looked at her. "You know that." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Honest reconsideration, not hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I do know that." "Then we plant it." She reached out and the sphere moved toward her hand, and she let it rest on her palm, and the light in it flared gently at her touch. Recognition, warmth, the same harmony the Founder's chamber produced when they were both in it. She looked at it for a long moment. "The center of the castle," she said. "Together." "Together," he said, and put his hand under hers, both of them holding the sphere, and the light inside it was extraordinary, everything at once. They went down. The oldest stones of Hogwarts were below the dungeon level, below the chamber itself, accessible through a passage that opened for them with no effort at all, the castle making way, the castle anticipating, the way it had been doing for weeks. The passage was ancient and low-ceilinged, and the stones of the walls were the original stones, rough-cut and deeply embedded, and the castle's warmth was stronger here than anywhere else Harry had felt it, the heat of something very old and very alive. The center was a chamber no bigger than a large wardrobe, perfectly cylindrical, with a floor of bare bedrock and walls of the founding stones, and at the center of the floor a circular marking that Harry recognized from the Founder's chamber, the same inlay of dark stone, but older, the original, the one the chamber above had been modeled on. The sphere pulsed in their hands. What do we do?" Harry said. "The castle isn't giving me specific instructions." "There are no instructions," Hermione said. "I don't think it works like that." She looked at the stone floor, at the circular marking. "I think we just put it down and mean it." They crouched together over the circular marking, both holding the sphere, and Harry thought about what it meant to mean something, not to say it or to perform it, but to actually intend it, to commit your full self to a single true thing. He thought about a school he'd arrived at when he was 11 years old, with no expectations and no family and no idea what the world was, and how it had given him all 3 of those things. He thought about what it should be for the next 11-year-old who arrived with nothing. He felt Hermione thinking beside him, or something like thinking, the focused warmth of her full attention on the same question. They lowered the sphere to the stone. The sound that came was not the Founder's chamber's harmonics. It was older and larger, the sound of the castle's entire body resonating at once, every stone from the foundations to the astronomy tower vibrating at a frequency so deep it was felt rather than heard, in the chest, in the bones, in some layer of awareness below the physical that Harry had developed in the past weeks. The sphere touched the stone and the light exploded outward, not visibly, not as a flash, but as a wave of warmth that moved through the bedrock and upward through the castle's structure in a slow geological expansion. The circular marking in the floor lit up, the same gold as the Founder's chamber glyphs, and then it darkened again and the sphere was gone, absorbed, incorporated, and the floor looked exactly as it had, and the castle was different. Harry stood up slowly. He couldn't point to what was different in any way that would have satisfied a technical analysis. The wards were the same, the physical structure was the same, but the quality of the castle's presence was changed in the way that a room changes when you understand what it means to you, not physically altered but revealed, the thing that was always there now fully legible. "It's complete," Hermione said. "Yes." She pressed her hand to the ancient wall beside her, and he watched her feel what he was feeling through her own connection. The castle as it was meant to be, the founding intent fully integrated, the 1,000-year-old seed finally planted in ground that was ready for it. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. She said it the way she said things she didn't expect to say, surprised by her own feeling. He looked at her in the ancient warmth of the lowest chamber and thought, yes, it is. What happened over the following week was both large-scale and surprisingly quiet, the way the most significant changes often were. The castle's transformation was not dramatic in the way that battles were dramatic or presentations were dramatic. It was gradual and pervasive, a deepening quality in the air that visitors noticed before they knew what they were noticing. Students who came for tour of the reconstruction reported feeling welcomed in a way they couldn't articulate, and the ones who'd been at Hogwarts before the war said it felt like the school had come back but different, more itself somehow, the way a person who has recovered from a serious illness is more themselves than before. The wards held, the rebuilding continued. The Hufflepuff and Slytherin chairs in the Founder's chamber, Harry and Hermione went to check on the morning after planting the seed, were no longer dark. They were faintly luminous, the same gold as the others, occupied by no one and ready for someone. Thorn was formally charged with performing an illegal ritual with intent to cause magical harm. His governance proposal died quietly in the Wizengamot, 3 of the 4 members who'd attended the presentation having already withdrawn their support, and the 4th following after Kingsley had a private conversation that he did not detail to anyone, but that produced results. Thorn's lawyer was very good and the proceedings would be long, and Harry didn't expect a simple resolution, but the legal architecture of the traditional governance movement had been gutted, and everyone who mattered knew it. Selwyn Sr. issued a formal statement through his solicitor expressing support for the foundational text's historical authenticity and withdrawing the hereditary entitlement claim, which was the statement of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was taking the dignified exit. Fenwick Selwyn's charges were reviewed in light of his cooperation and reduced to something that would result in community service rather than custody, which Harry thought was about right. Caro's case was going to take longer, and Harry had told Kingsley he wanted to be involved in any future conversations with her, which Kingsley had agreed to with the expression of someone who had learned not to ask Harry Potter to explain the specific shape of his judgment calls, because the judgment calls generally proved sound. Ron was at Hogwarts for most of it, drifting between the reconstruction work and long conversations with McGonagall about the school's future curriculum, and the occasional evening in the kitchen with Harry and Hermione, where the 3 of them ate and talked, and were simply, for a few hours, people who knew each other well and liked each other's company. George visited once, unexpectedly, and walked through the great hall with his hands in his pockets and his face doing something private, and then sat with Ron for 3 hours, and came out looking different in the way that grief sometimes allowed, not lighter exactly but less compressed. Ginny came on the 7th day and found Harry in the grounds watching the grass grow back along the edge of the forbidden forest, which it was still doing with the particular determination of a natural thing that had been disrupted and was correcting itself. She sat beside him on the stone wall at the ground's edge, and they watched the grass for a while in the comfortable silence of people who had shared something significant and were still in the process of deciding what it meant. "You're good," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I mean it as a genuine observation. You're better than I've seen you, maybe better than I've seen you ever." She looked at the tree line. "Hogwarts suits you, this thing you're doing here." "It does," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't been able to mean things about himself for a long time. "And Hermione." He looked at the tree line. "Harry, Ginny, I'm not about to make a speech," she said. "I'm not that person. I just want to say that I see it and it's right and you should stop being careful about it." She glanced at him. "You're not the type to be careful about things that matter. Don't start now." He looked at her, this person he had loved and who had loved him and who knew the specific shape of his caution better than most. "You're all right," he said, "completely." She said it with the total certainty that was Ginny's particular gift, the certainty of someone who knows herself and acts accordingly. "I've been all right for a while. I just wanted you to know I'm not the reason you're being careful." A pause. "If that's useful information." "It is," he said. She nodded, satisfied. "Good." She stood up, brushed stone dust from her robes. "Also, the new ward structure your Hermione built around the Quidditch pitch is extraordinary, so if you could tell her that from me." "She's not he started. Ginny gave him a look of such complete and serene patience that he stopped. "Tell her I said it," Ginny said, and left. He found Hermione in the library. Not in her study room but in the main library, which Madame Pince had declared structurally sound and partially reopened. The water-damaged sections still in recovery but the rest of the shelves accessible, the smell of old books and drying parchment, and the particular quality of a space where knowledge was cared for and it knew it. Hermione was at a table near the window with a stack of books that was slightly ambitious even by her standards, and she had a quill in her hand and the expression of someone who has found the answer to one question and it has opened 11 more. He sat across from her. She didn't look up immediately, which meant she was mid-sentence in her head and he'd arrived at the comma rather than the full stop. He waited. He was very good at waiting for her now. He'd always been good at it, but he was better now, more settled in it, the way he was more settled in most things that had to do with her. She finished her thought, wrote it down, put the quill down and looked up. Ginny says the ward structure on the Quidditch pitch is extraordinary, he said. I know, Hermione said. I made it extraordinary specifically because Ginny is going to use it most and she deserves the best version. A pause. What did you two talk about? Grass, he said. She studied him for a moment with the focused attention that cut through most of his deflections. He let it. The Hufflepuff and Slytherin chairs are lit, he said. I know, I checked this morning. She looked at him steadily. Do you have a theory? Not about who, about when. He leaned forward on the table. I think the castle is waiting for us to finish something. The way the last 40 days have been building, the seed, the founding intent, everything we've been putting back into place. There's one thing that isn't finished. She was very still in the way she got when she was tracking something exactly. The school isn't officially refounded, he said. McGonagall runs it, the reconstruction is almost done, the magic is right, but there's no formal declaration, no public moment where the new Hogwarts says what it is. He paused. I think the castle needs us to do that. The Wizengamot, not the Wizengamot, the castle, the way the original founders did it. He looked at the window, the grounds visible through it, the tree line and the lake and the grey October sky. A formal founding declaration. At Hogwarts, with the founders' magic active on the record in the way that counts. He looked back at her. Which would require us to stand in front of everyone and say exactly what this school is and what it stands for, and make it the kind of statement the castle can hear and respond to. Hermione's expression had gone somewhere that was complicated and bright and not quite as organized as her usual thinking face. When, before term starts, he said, November 1st, give the reconstruction teams 3 more weeks, get the school properly functional, and on November 1st make the declaration and open the doors. He paused. Start small. This year is the year for getting it right, not the year for full enrollment. Invite students back on a voluntary basis. Let it be their choice. She was looking at him with an expression he'd been seeing more of recently, the one that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite recognition, but was something between them, the look of someone who is watching a person they know well do something that confirms what they'd hoped was true about them. That's very good, she said quietly. I have thoughts occasionally. Harry. She said his name the way she said it when the deflection wasn't what she meant to respond to, when she was saying something through the name rather than past it. He looked at her. The library was quiet around them, Madame Pince somewhere in the water-damaged section with her drying charms, the shelves holding their books with the patient satisfaction of shelves that have had their books back. The November light through the window was doing the thing it did, that particular diffuse quality that was neither harsh nor soft. Ginny told me to stop being careful, he said. Hermione blinked. Then the corners of her mouth did something. Did she? She was very clear about it. She usually is. A pause. And are you going to? He reached across the table and picked up her hand from beside her notebook. Not the way he'd held it in the founder's chamber, not the warm, steady hold of 2 people acknowledging something between them, but differently, his fingers finding the spaces between hers, which was a more specific kind of statement. I've been thinking, he said, about the word Ginny used, you're Hermione. She said that. The organization in her face had come entirely down, and what was there instead was just her, entirely present, slightly wide-eyed in the way that meant she hadn't fully marshaled herself yet for what was happening. I said she hadn't, she implied it. He looked at their hands on her notebook. I think she's right, though, in the best version of what that means. Hermione looked at their hands, too. When she looked up, her expression was completely honest and a little bit undone, and he thought it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. In the best version, she said carefully, it would be reciprocal. That was the implication I was working with, yes. Right, she exhaled slowly. So when you say, I mean that you are the person I want beside me for this, he said. Not because we're bonded to the same castle, or because the magic chose us together, or because we've always worked well in proximity. I mean it personally, I mean it as a choice. A pause. I've been meaning it as a choice for longer than I was admitting. She was looking at him with the complete attention she brought to things that mattered, and the library was very quiet, and the November light was exactly right, and she said, so have I, in the simple, direct way she said the truest things. He leaned across the table and kissed her, which was quiet and warm and felt like the castle's recognition, not dramatic or performed, just completely right, the feeling of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for you and the waiting had been worth it. When they broke apart, she was looking at him with the brightness in her eyes and a smile she clearly wasn't managing, and she said, we have an enormous amount of work still to do. I know. The declaration, the school opening, the Carrow follow-up, the Selwyn documentation, Thorne's legal proceedings, the Hufflepuff and Slytherin chairs, Hermione. Yes, I know all that, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a moment. Then the smile came fully, the real one, the one she kept for things that had earned it, and it was extraordinary. Good, she said. Neither am I. November 1st was clear and cold. The sky the deep blue of autumn at its best, frost on the grounds that caught the morning light and held it in brief diamond points before the sun moved past and released it. They were all there. McGonagall at the doors in her best robes, with the expression she'd worn at every significant moment Harry had ever shared with her, the controlled emotion, the undeniable pride. Flitwick beside her, beaming, wearing a scarf that was half gold and half bronze, because he'd apparently decided on the day that such compromises were beneath the occasion, and had transfigured it into something that incorporated all four house colors in a pattern Hermione described as ambitious and Harry described as a lot. Ron and Ginny, standing together with the Weasley quality of being more themselves than most people managed, Ron's hands in his pockets, Ginny's arms crossed, both of them watching the proceedings with the particular warmth of people who had been there from the beginning of a thing that had become worth being there for. Neville, who had been at the reconstruction since the first day and who would, though nobody had formally discussed it yet, almost certainly end up teaching herbology here within a year, standing beside Hannah Abbott, who had arrived to help with the November opening and had not shown any signs of leaving. Kingsley in his minister's robes, present not to govern or oversee but simply to witness, which was the right kind of ministerial presence, and he'd understood that without being told. Journalists, yes, the press had been invited and they were there because this needed to be on the record, needed to be public in the way that the founding documents were public and the pensive memory was public. This moment needed witnesses and students. 47 of them who had received the invitation to return on a voluntary basis and who had made the choice, some of them with family hesitation and some of them without any hesitation at all, to come back to the place that had been building toward being ready for them. Harry and Hermione stood at the top of the steps before the open doors. Harry looked out at all of it, the people and the grounds and the castle behind him, the wards he could feel like a second skin, the deep foundation with its planted seed, the founder's chamber and its lit chairs, and felt with complete clarity that he was exactly where he was supposed to be and had got here by exactly the right path. Hermione looked at him and he looked at her and she nodded once. He turned to the gathered crowd. "Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry is open," he said. Not loudly, the castle carried it. For every child with magic, regardless of blood, family, background, or where they come from, free as it was always meant to be free, protected as it was always meant to be protected. He paused. "What you're walking into today is not what it was before, it's better, it's what it was supposed to be from the beginning." He stepped aside, the doors were already open, the students walked in. Something happened when they crossed the threshold. Harry felt it through the castle's awareness and Hermione felt it through the structural connection. The same moment of recognition they'd experienced in September but extended, multiplied, the castle receiving 47 new presences and responding to each of them individually. Not the claiming that had happened to Harry and Hermione, something gentler, a welcome, the deep magic of the place saying to each of them in turn, "You belong here. You have always belonged here." Two of the students stopped just inside the doors, the way Hermione had stopped on their first morning in September, and looked up at the restored ceiling and the warm light. A small girl with her mother's hand still loosely held turned around and looked back at the open doors and the grounds and the November sky with an expression of pure overwhelm that she hadn't managed to contain, and her mother at the foot of the steps saw it and put her hand over her mouth. Harry saw all of it. He thought about being 11 years old and stepping through these doors for the first time with no expectations and no map for what was happening to him, and the feeling that had moved through him even then that this was a place that was going to matter. He thought, yes, that's the thing, that's what we were building. Hermione had come to stand beside him on the steps, watching the students enter, and he felt her hand find his without either of them looking, and he held it. "Two dark chairs," she said quietly after a while. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about them." "Your theory, my theory," she confirmed. "The castle isn't waiting for two more people to bond to it the way we did. I don't think it works that way twice." She was watching the last of the students enter, the November light on her face. "I think the Hufflepuff and Slytherin seats are waiting for something we build. Something we create here that embodies those values so completely the castle recognizes them and seats them." A pause. "Not people, traditions, institutions, the Hufflepuff value of belonging, of every person being worth equal effort that gets seated when it's real enough to be recognized. The Slytherin value of ambition and resourcefulness directed toward the right ends, same. So we have to build the school well enough," Harry said. "We have to build the school to what it was meant to be," she said. "Completely, not 90% all the way." She looked at him. "I think we can." "I know we can," he said. She considered this, confident. Very. The last student crossed the threshold. The doors stayed open. They were going to stay open. That was the new policy. The castle's doors opened during daylight hours, which McGonagall had responded to with a single nod that meant both obviously and it's about time. Hermione turned from the doors and looked at Harry fully, and she was lit up in the way she'd been in the original chamber. Not metaphorically, the actual warm gold of the Founder's connection was briefly visible in her skin, in her eyes, the castle expressing its recognition of her in the morning light. "Well," she said, and her voice had something in it that was pure and simple and entirely hers. "Well," he said back. She smiled, he smiled. The castle hummed around them both, deep and content and alive, the living magic of the seed they'd planted moving slowly upward through the foundation stones, taking root, becoming permanent. They went inside. 2 months later, on the first day of the new term, the real term, the full term with full enrollment and 4 functioning houses, and the Sorting Hat delivering a new speech that had apparently been in revision for 1,000 years and had finally gotten it right. The Hufflepuff chair in the founder's chamber lit up. Harry felt it through his ward sense at breakfast. He looked at Hermione across the table. She was reading the Morning Post and drinking tea, and she looked up when she felt it through the structural connection and met his eyes. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The Slytherin chair took another year. When it lit, on the morning of the day, the school's first full post-war graduating class received their certifications, 40 students in their best robes standing in the Great Hall with their whole lives ahead of them. Hermione was in the middle of a sentence to McGonagall about curriculum revisions, and Harry was watching a first-year learn to levitate a feather for the first time. They both felt it simultaneously, the double pulse of the Founder's chamber going fully lit for the first time, all 4 seats, 1,000 years of waiting finally resolved. Harry looked across the hall. Hermione was already looking at him. She was smiling, and it was the real one, the whole one, the one that had been there from the beginning, earned through every impossible thing and offered freely and irreversible now, the way the best things always were. He mouthed, "We did it." She shook her head slightly in the way that meant both yes and of course we did, and did you doubt it, and never all at once. The castle complete at last, all 4 seats lit, and the founding intent alive in every stone from the bedrock to the astronomy tower, held them all, students and teachers and founders and ghosts and portraits, and the 400 years of Hogwarts that had passed and the 400 years that were coming, and it was whole. It was home. It had always been home. It always would be.